Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. I've never been a fan of camping, but when my friend Mike insisted on a weekend trip to Deep Hollow Woods, I let him talk me into it. He said the forest was beautiful, untouched by civilization, a place where you could see the stars as bright as day. So I packed my bag and tried to psych myself up, though a strange pit settled in my stomach the moment we crossed into the dense, dark forest. Deep Hollow felt wrong, as if the trees themselves were watching us, ancient and wise. We hiked for hours until we found a spot that Mike insisted was perfect. It was a small clearing ringed by towering pines, thick moss blanketing the ground, and an eerie silence that pressed in like a physical weight. I asked Mike if he heard anything strange, but he just laughed, saying I was being paranoid. But I knew something was off. There were no birds singing, no insects buzzing, just dead silence, broken only by our footsteps. We set up camp, and as the sun began to sink below the horizon, that uneasy feeling grew. I told myself it was just nerves. We were miles away from any town, deep in the wilderness. It was supposed to be quiet out here, right? But as darkness took hold, the silence became suffocating, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Then, just as we settled by the fire, we heard it, a strange, distant howling, unlike any animal I'd ever heard. It was deep, guttural, and it seemed to echo through the trees, bouncing off the trunks and twisting around us. I glanced at Mike, but he looked just as uneasy as I felt. "That's weird," he mumbled. "Maybe it's just coyotes." But we both knew it wasn't. I'd heard coyotes before, and this was different. It had a strange, almost human quality, like someone in agony, mixed with an animal's snarl. We tried to brush it off, convincing ourselves it was just our minds playing tricks, but then the smell hit us. It was a pungent, sickening stench, like rotting meat and wet fur. Mike gagged, covering his nose, and I fought the urge to do the same. Then, in the faint light of our campfire, I saw something move. It was just a flash of something pale like skin, but it was gone before I could make out any details. I turned to Mike, who was staring into the trees, his face pale. "You saw that, right?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, unable to tear my eyes away from the darkness. The howling began again, closer this time, and I could hear something crashing through the underbrush, moving fast, too fast. We grabbed our flashlights and shone them into the trees, but there was nothing, just shadows and twisted branches that seemed to reach out, clawing at the air. We stood there frozen, waiting for something to happen, but all we heard was silence. We exchanged a look, both of us silently agreeing that it was time to leave. We started packing up, moving quickly, but that's when the footsteps started. They were heavy, deliberate, circling us, and I could feel the weight of something watching, just beyond the firelight. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, and for a brief moment I saw it. It was tall, easily 7 feet, hunched over with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, oh God, its eyes were pitch black, like 2 holes carved into its face. It didn't look human, but it didn't look entirely animal either. It had a snout like a dog, but elongated, twisted, with teeth that gleamed in the light. "No!" Mike screamed, and the creature's head snapped toward him, its mouth opening in a silent snarl. It moved then, quick as lightning, disappearing into the shadows. We ran, abandoning our gear, crashing through the trees, desperate to get away. The footsteps followed, heavy and relentless, and every time I glanced back, I saw flashes of that pale skin, those black eyes, tracking us through the trees. After what felt like an eternity, we burst into another clearing, where a small cabin stood, its windows dark, the door slightly ajar. Without thinking, we ran inside, slamming the door behind us. The cabin was old, dusty, and it looked like it hadn't been used in years. But at least it was shelter. We huddled in the corner, breathing heavily, listening to the creature's footsteps as they circled the cabin. Then we heard a voice. It was low, barely a whisper, but it echoed through the cabin, sending chills down my spine. "You shouldn't have come here." We spun around, and there in the shadows was an old man in a park ranger's uniform. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, as if he hadn't seen sunlight in years. "They don't like visitors," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You need to leave." Before we could respond, he pointed to a trapdoor in the floor. "Go. Now." We didn't question him. We opened the trapdoor and climbed down, finding ourselves in a narrow underground tunnel. We followed it, crawling on our hands and knees, the smell of damp earth filling our lungs. We could hear the footsteps above us pounding against the floor and the low, guttural growl of the creature. Finally, we emerged into the forest, miles from where we had started. We ran until our lungs burned, until the first light of dawn touched the trees, and we stumbled out onto a dirt road. Weeks later, I went back to Deep Hollow Woods, desperate for answers. But when I asked the locals about the park ranger or the cabin, they just looked at me with a strange expression. "There hasn't been a park ranger in those woods for years," one man said, shaking his head. "The last one disappeared a long time ago. They say he got lost in the woods and never came back." I wanted to argue, to insist that I'd seen him, that he'd saved us, but the look in the man's eyes told me not to. So I left. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that something is still watching me, that I left something behind in those woods. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that low guttural howl drifting through the trees, calling me back to Deep Hollow. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was a mix of boredom and a bit of that thrill-seeking foolishness that creeps up sometimes. But there I was, setting up my tent in the darkest, most isolated part of Grizzly Ridge, a remote corner of the state forest that locals didn't even mention, let alone visit. I'd heard stories, of course, rumors about strange things lurking in these woods, but I figured it was all just talk, local legends meant to scare tourists. I should have known better. The sun was setting by the time I got my fire going. The air was thick with that earthy forest smell, but there was something else too, a faint, almost metallic scent that made my skin crawl. As the darkness deepened, so did the silence, an oppressive hush that wrapped around me like a blanket. I tried to shake it off, listening to the crackling of the fire, but the quiet seemed to stretch on, until it felt like a living thing, pressing in on all sides. That's when I noticed the eyes. At first they were just faint glimmers at the edge of the firelight, blinking in and out among the trees. I thought maybe they were the reflections of some animals, deer perhaps or coyotes. But they didn't move like animals. They were too still, too steady, just staring, watching. I called out, trying to scare them off, but they didn't budge. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks in the dark. Then I heard it, a faint rustling like footsteps circling around me. I grabbed my flashlight, swinging it in a wide arc, but the light just seemed to disappear into the darkness, swallowed up by the shadows. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment everything was still. Then a low, rasping breath echoed through the trees, so close that I could feel it on my skin. My stomach twisted, and I took a step back, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. But there was no answer, just silence. I took another step back, and that's when I saw it, a figure, half hidden in the shadows, crouched low to the ground. It was tall, impossibly so, with long limbs that seemed to stretch and bend in unnatural angles. Its skin was pale, almost gray, and its eyes, they were black, so black that they seemed to absorb the light, twin voids that held me in place, unable to move. Then it smiled, revealing rows of jagged teeth, sharp and glistening in the faint light. The smell hit me then, a stench so foul that it made my eyes water, a mixture of rot and decay that clung to the air like a thick fog. I stumbled back, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It moved then, quick and fluid, circling me with a grace that was almost mesmerizing, like it was playing with me, savoring my fear. I turned to run, but I heard a voice, low and raspy, coming from somewhere in the trees. "You're not supposed to be here." I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice was close, too close, and it was followed by a faint shuffling sound. I turned slowly, and there, standing on the edge of the clearing, was a park ranger. He looked old, his uniform faded and torn, his face weathered and pale. But his eyes, they were the same black voids as the creatures, empty and hollow, watching me with a predatory stillness. "You need to leave," he said, his voice cold and flat. "They don't like trespassers." Before I could ask him who they were, he pointed to a narrow path leading deeper into the forest. I didn't want to go that way, but something in his gaze told me I didn't have a choice. I started down the path, glancing back to see the ranger still watching me, his expression unreadable. As I moved, I could feel something following me, a constant prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like a pair of eyes boring into my skin. The path twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the darkness. The trees seemed to close in, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, snagging at my clothes, pulling me back. I kept moving, though, too scared to stop, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The footsteps followed, growing louder, heavier, until they were right behind me. I didn't dare look back. Finally, I saw a faint light up ahead, and I broke into a run, desperate to escape. I burst out of the trees and into a small clearing, my heart racing, my lungs burning. I looked around, expecting to see the ranger, but he was gone. In his place was something else, a small weathered cabin, its windows dark, its door hanging open. I approached it slowly, peering inside, but there was nothing there. Just an empty room filled with dust and cobwebs, as if it hadn't been touched in years. But on the floor, scrawled in dark, almost black letters, were words that made my blood run cold. "They watch, they wait, they hunger." I backed away, my mind reeling, and turned to leave, but the path was gone. The trees had shifted, closing in around the cabin, their twisted branches blocking any escape. And then I heard it, the rasping breath, the faint rustling, the slow, deliberate footsteps drawing closer. I turned, and there, standing in the doorway of the cabin, was the ranger. But now his face was wrong, twisted and contorted, his skin stretched tight over his skull, his eyes empty and black. He smiled, that same jagged grin, and took a step forward. "You never should have come here," he whispered, his voice a cold hiss. "Now you're one of us." And as the darkness closed in, I realized that I was no longer afraid, because now I could see them too. The creatures, the shadows, the things that lurk in the woods. They were all around me, watching, waiting. And I knew that I would never leave this place, not really. I was part of it now, bound to the forest, to the darkness, to the hunger. So if you ever find yourself in Grizzly Ridge, if you ever feel those eyes on you, turn back. Leave while you can, because once the forest has you, it never lets you go. I always loved the outdoors, so when I found myself with a long weekend, I decided to go camping in Ravenwood Forest. People had warned me about Ravenwood, saying it was haunted, that strange things happened there, but I didn't buy into the ghost stories. I wanted peace and quiet, a chance to escape from the noise of the city. Little did I know I would find anything but that. The forest was dense, even more so than I'd expected. By the time I reached my campsite, the sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out like fingers. I quickly set up my tent, built a fire, and settled in, enjoying the crackling of the flames and the cool evening air. For a while, everything was perfect. That was when I heard the footsteps. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer. I'd heard about how plentiful the wildlife was out here. But these footsteps were heavy, deliberate. They stopped just at the edge of the clearing, and in the fading light I saw a figure. A park ranger or so, I thought. He was wearing a ranger's hat and jacket, but something about him was off. His face was shadowed, almost like he didn't have one at all. "Evening," he said in a low, gravelly voice. "You know this area's restricted, right?" I blinked in confusion. I hadn't seen any signs, no indication that I wasn't supposed to be there. I'm sorry. I didn't know," I stammered, feeling my face flush with embarrassment. He stepped closer, and as he did, the firelight caught his face, but there was something wrong with it. His skin looked too tight, stretched like plastic over a mannequin. His eyes were empty, hollow, like they were staring right through me. "You should leave," he said, his tone flat, almost mechanical. "They don't like strangers here." "Who doesn't like strangers?" I asked, my heart pounding. His expression didn't change, but he paused as if considering whether to answer. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back into the darkness, disappearing into the trees. I was rattled, but I tried to shake it off. He was just a creepy ranger, I told myself, probably messing with me for being in his territory. I turned back to the fire, adding a few more logs and hoping they'd settle my nerves. But the forest had gone quiet, deathly quiet, like it was holding its breath. An hour passed, maybe more, and the fire had burned low. I was dozing off when I heard the footsteps again, the same heavy, deliberate steps. This time they didn't stop at the edge of the clearing. I looked up and saw a figure stepping out from the shadows. It was the same ranger. "You again," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Look, if I'm not supposed to be here, I can leave first thing in the morning." He didn't answer. He just stared at me with those hollow eyes. Then, in a voice that wasn't quite his own, he said, "Do you hear them?" I swallowed hard, feeling a chill run down my spine. "Hear what?" He tilted his head, and I could have sworn I saw a flicker of something else beneath his face, like another face hidden just under the surface. "The echoes," he whispered, "the ones that call to you. They want you to follow." And then, without warning, he disappeared. Not into the woods, he just vanished, like he'd never been there at all. I was officially spooked. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the tree line, but there was nothing, only shadows that seemed to dance and twist in the beam of light. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. But deep down I knew there was something more to it, something wrong with this place. Then I heard it, a voice, faint and distant, calling my name. It was a woman's voice, soft and familiar, but impossible to place. "Nathan," it whispered, stretching out in the darkness. My blood ran cold. I knew no one out here, no one who would know my name. I stayed put, gripping my flashlight like it was a weapon. But the voice came again, closer this time, with an edge of urgency. "Nathan, come closer." I stood up, stepping back from the fire, my heart racing. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing back to me through the trees. Silence. I was about to turn back when I saw a shape moving between the trees. A woman in a white dress, her hair tangled and wild, her face obscured by shadows. She was gliding toward me, her bare feet hovering just above the ground. I stepped back, but my legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot as she drew closer, reaching out to me with slender, ghostly fingers. As she got closer, her face became clearer, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. It was my mother's face, twisted in a grotesque smile. But it couldn't be her. She'd passed away years ago. I stumbled back, the fire casting long, flickering shadows around me as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure stopped, tilting her head. "Nathan, why don't you come home?" she whispered, her voice dripping with something that felt like a mockery of love. "We miss you." I ran. I didn't look back. I just ran, plunging through the trees, branches scratching at my arms and face as I tore through the underbrush. The voice followed me, echoing through the forest, repeating my name over and over again. "Nathan, Nathan." After what felt like hours, I broke through the trees and stumbled onto an old dirt road. I kept running, adrenaline carrying me until I finally saw the lights of a small ranger station up ahead. I burst inside, breathless and wild-eyed, and the ranger on duty looked at me like I was crazy. I tried to explain, to tell him about the voices, the strange ranger, and the ghostly woman. He listened, his face growing pale as I talked, and then he shook his head slowly. "You're lucky you made it out," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're not the first one to see them. Ravenwood's been haunted for years, by the Watchers. They look like people you know, people you love, but they're not. They're echoes, luring people into the woods, and once you go too far, you never come back." I left Ravenwood that night, and I haven't been back since, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear my name being called, soft and distant, echoing through the silence. And I wonder if they're still waiting for me, out there in the shadows, calling me back to join them. I grew up near the forest, so when I finally joined the National Park Service as a ranger, it felt like destiny. I was assigned to a remote part of the woods, where the trees are so dense that even in daylight, it feels like twilight. The wildlife is sparse, and most of my duties involve walking through trails that hardly anyone uses. But it was peaceful, until the day it wasn't. It started during a routine patrol. I was about a mile into the woods when I noticed something strange. The birds had gone silent, and the only sound was the crunch of my boots against the underbrush. I thought maybe a predator was nearby, a bear or a mountain lion, but then I heard something that made my skin crawl, a whistle. It was faint, almost indistinguishable, but there was no mistaking it. It wasn't the wind, and it sure wasn't an animal. I called out, "Is anyone there?" My voice was swallowed by the trees. There was no response, just an eerie, unnatural silence. I decided to press on, chalking it up to my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night I camped out near one of the more remote trailheads. I was alone, surrounded by towering pines and oaks. The forest seemed to press in on me, closer than it ever had before. Around midnight, as I sat by the fire, I heard it again, the whistle, clearer this time and closer. I stood up, scanning the dark tree line with my flashlight. "Hello? Show yourself," I called, trying to sound braver than I felt. The whistling stopped, replaced by a low growl, deep and guttural. My blood ran cold. I swung the flashlight around, and there it was, two gleaming eyes reflecting the light back at me. They were too high off the ground to belong to a wolf or a bear, and too far apart to be human. I froze, my hand instinctively going to the handle of my knife. Then, the creature stepped forward, and I got a glimpse of it. It was tall, impossibly tall, with the body of a man, but covered in coarse, dark fur. Its face was a grotesque blend of human and wolf, with elongated, snarling jaws and fangs that glistened in the firelight. Its eyes bore into mine, intelligent and cruel, like it knew exactly what I was thinking, and that I wouldn't make it out alive. Before I could react, it vanished back into the trees. I stood there, paralyzed, listening to the silence that followed, broken only by the crackling of the fire. I wanted to believe I'd imagined it, but I knew what I saw was real. The Dogman. I'd heard rumors from other rangers, whispered stories of strange creatures that lurked in these woods, but I never believed them. Until now. The next day, I tried to report what I'd seen, but I couldn't find the words without sounding crazy. So I brushed it off and decided to patrol a different section of the park, farther from my last encounter. But something had changed. It was as if the forest itself had become hostile, every shadow hiding something sinister. That night I camped again, keeping my fire small and my senses alert. Just past midnight, I heard something crunching through the underbrush, approaching my camp. This time I didn't wait. I grabbed my flashlight and knife and burst out of the tent. There, standing at the edge of the firelight, was a creature even more twisted than the last. A skinwalker, if I had to name it. It was shifting, its form warping between animal and human, as if it couldn't decide what to be. Its skin stretched and snapped like leather over bone, and its eyes glowed with a malevolent hunger. I backed away, trying to put as much distance between us as possible, but my foot caught on a root, and I fell hard. I scrambled to get up, but the skinwalker was already looming over me. Just as it reached down, its fingers contorting into claws, I heard a gunshot. The creature shrieked and vanished into the shadows. I looked up and saw another ranger, one I'd never met before, standing there with a rifle. He looked like he'd seen a ghost, and he barely spoke a word as he helped me to my feet. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice trembling. "This place belongs to them." We walked back to the ranger station in silence, and I thought about quitting on the spot. But curiosity gnawed at me. The next day, I asked it about the ranger who had saved me, but my supervisor gave me a confused look. "There's no one out here by that name," he said. "You were alone." To this day, I don't know what I saw out there. I never went back to that part of the woods, and I keep telling myself it was just a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by stress. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that whistle. It echoes through the trees, a reminder that I wasn't alone, and that whatever's out there hasn't forgotten me. I'm no longer a ranger, but the forest is still out there, waiting, watching. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear that whistling drifting through the air, calling me back to the woods. When I tell people about my night in Timberwood Forest, they usually don't believe me. I don't blame them. Sometimes I can hardly believe it myself. But that night is burned into my memory. Every sound, every shadow. It all started when I decided to go camping alone, just to clear my head. I thought I knew those woods. I'd camped there a dozen times. But this time, something was different. I wasn't alone. I set up camp just before dusk, deep in the forest where the trees were so thick that barely any light made it through. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of pine and earth, and the usual chorus of forest sounds seemed distant, muffled. It was as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting. I shrugged it off and lit a fire, trying to push away the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach. As darkness fell, I heard footsteps approaching, crunching over the dry leaves. I turned, expecting to see another camper, but what I saw was a park ranger. He was older, with graying hair and a faded uniform, and his face looked like it had seen more than a fair share of things he'd rather forget. He gave me a small nod and I waved, a little relieved to see another human face. "Out here alone, huh?" he said, his voice carrying a hint of warning. "These woods, they've got their own rules. Sometimes people wander in and don't make it back out." I laughed it off, trying to mask my discomfort. "I'll be fine. I've been camping here plenty of times." He shook his head slowly, his eyes darkening. "Not like this, you haven't. You heard of the Watchers?" I hadn't. I thought he was just trying to scare me, but the way he spoke made me uneasy. He looked past me, his gaze fixed on something far off into the shadows. "They've been here long before any of us," he continued. "They look like us sometimes, but they're not. They watch, they wait, and if they want you, they'll take you." I laughed, but it sounded hollow, even to me. He just stood there, staring into the darkness, and then he muttered something under his breath, a prayer maybe, and turned to leave. Just before he vanished into the trees, he looked back, his face pale in the firelight. "If you see one, don't look away, and don't try to run. They like the chase." Then he was gone, and I was alone again. I tried to shake off his words, convincing myself he was just messing with me. But the silence was heavy, pressing in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. A few hours later, the fire was dying down, and I was half asleep when I heard it. A rustling, like someone or something was moving just beyond the tree line. I sat up, squinting into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. Then, just on the edge of the firelight, I saw movement. A figure emerged slowly, stepping into the dim glow. It looked like a person, a man about my height, but there was something off. His face was expressionless, almost mannequin-like, and his eyes, they were too dark, too empty, like they were holes that went on forever. "Are you lost?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. He just stood there staring at me, his head tilted slightly to one side. Then he took a step forward, and I realized with a sickening jolt that he was barefoot, his feet leaving no tracks in the dirt. I remembered what the ranger had said, "Don't look away." I kept my eyes fixed on him, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. He took another step, and another, each one bringing him closer until he was standing right at the edge of the light. He was close enough now that I could see his skin wasn't quite right, too smooth, too shiny, like wax stretched over bone. Then he did something that made my blood run cold. He smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. His mouth stretched wide, too wide, like his face was splitting open. And then he whispered, in a voice that was almost mine, "Come with us." I wanted to run, to scream, but I was frozen, rooted to the spot. And then, just behind him, I saw another figure and another. They all looked like me, but wrong, twisted, misshapen. They had my face, my clothes, but their eyes were empty, lifeless. I thought back to what the ranger had said about the Watchers, about them taking people. These weren't just mimics, they were replacements. They were there to take my place, to wear my skin and walk back into the world, while I disappeared into the forest forever. I don't remember deciding to move, but suddenly I was on my feet, backing away from them, keeping my eyes locked on their empty faces. I stumbled, nearly falling, but I didn't dare look away. The fire was dying, the light growing dim, and I knew that once it went out, they'd be on me. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, aiming it directly at them. The light hit them, and they recoiled, their faces twisting into expressions of rage, their skin rippling like liquid. I didn't wait to see what they'd do next. I turned and ran, not caring if they followed. I ran until my legs burned, until my lungs felt like they were going to burst. Somehow I made it back to my car. I drove out of those woods and didn't stop until I was miles away, until the dawn broke over the horizon. When I finally looked back, Timberwood was just a dark smudge in the rearview mirror, and I swore to myself I'd never go back. I don't know what those things were. I don't know if they're still out there, watching, waiting for someone else to stumble into their trap. But I do know one thing. They're real. And if you're ever alone in the woods and you see someone who looks like you, don't look away. Don't run. Just pray they let you leave. I've always felt at home in the wilderness, but this time things were different. This camping trip wasn't just about enjoying nature. It was about escaping my own life. After a rough breakup and quitting a job I hated, I needed time to reset. So I packed up my gear and drove out to an isolated spot deep in the Appalachian woods. It was a place my grandfather used to take me when I was a kid, full of memories and hidden trails. I thought it would be comforting. The first 2 days were uneventful, if a little lonely. I hiked through familiar paths, remembering stories my grandfather used to tell about the strange things he'd seen out here. Glowing eyes in the night, shadows that moved without anything to cast them. At the time I thought he was just trying to scare me, but on the third night, as I sat by the campfire, those stories started to feel a little too real. It began as a distant noise, a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the trees. At first, I thought it might be the wind, but then it grew louder, more rhythmic, like a pulse. It wasn't coming from any particular direction, but seemed to resonate from all around me. I stood up, looking around, but the forest was dark and still. I shook it off, assuming it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Later, as I crawled into my tent, I heard it again. This time it was closer, almost like chanting. Low, guttural voices, saying words I couldn't understand. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the light into the trees, but there was nothing there. Just the shadows and that terrible, pulsating hum. I sat there, waiting, hoping it would stop, but it only seemed to grow louder, vibrating in my bones. I barely slept that night. The chanting eventually faded, but I could still feel the hum under my skin, as if it had settled into my bones. By morning I was exhausted, but determined not to let it ruin my trip. I set off to explore a part of the woods I'd never ventured into before, hoping the distraction would clear my head. The further I walked, the more I noticed something odd. The trees in this area were twisted, almost bent over as if they'd been forced to grow in unnatural directions. I found strange markings carved into the bark, patterns that seemed familiar, but I couldn't quite place them. They looked almost like old runes or symbols, and the sight of them filled me with a deep, unsettling feeling. I decided it was best to turn back, but as I did, I saw something strange on the ground. It was a small wooden figure, carved roughly into the shape of a person, with twisted limbs and a face contorted in a silent scream. It looked ancient, weathered, and I felt a chill run through me as I picked it up. It was too deliberate to be a random piece of debris. Someone had left it there, maybe even as a warning. That night I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I sat by the fire, clutching my flashlight, every sound in the forest amplified by my nerves. Around midnight, I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling my campsite. I couldn't see anything, but I knew something was out there watching me. I called out, hoping it was just a lost hiker, but there was no response. Just the slow crunching of leaves as whatever it was moved closer. I scrambled back into my tent, heart pounding, and zipped it shut, as if that flimsy layer of nylon could protect me. I lay there, listening, as the footsteps stopped just outside. Then, something began scratching at the tent, long, slow scrapes that sent shivers down my spine. I was frozen, too scared to move, barely daring to breathe. Then I heard it, a voice soft and whispery, right outside the tent. It was my grandfather's voice, clear as day. "You shouldn't have come here," it said. "It's not safe anymore." I felt a surge of relief, thinking maybe this was all some cruel prank, some twisted way of him teaching me a lesson even from beyond the grave. But then I remembered, my grandfather had died years ago. There was no way it could be him, and that's when the voice changed. It became rougher, more guttural, almost animalistic. The voice began repeating, "Leave now," over and over, louder and louder, until it was practically screaming. In a panic, I grabbed my knife and slashed at the side of the tent, stumbling out into the darkness. The fire had gone out, and the forest was eerily silent again. No chanting, no humming, nothing. But I could feel something watching me, lurking just out of sight. I didn't even pack my things. I just ran, barely able to see where I was going. I tripped and fell more times than I can count, but somehow I made it back to my car by dawn. As I sped down the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something chasing me. But there was nothing, just the winding road and the trees. I never did find out what was in those woods, but I left everything behind that day, my gear, my tent, even that carved figure. Whatever it was, I didn't want any reminder of it. When I got home, I did some research, hoping to find an explanation. I found stories of old rituals, of ancient beings that guarded the woods, creatures that could take on familiar voices to lure you deeper into the trees. They say if you hear the voice of someone you know in the woods, you should never respond, because it's not them. It's something else, something that wants you to come closer. I still think about that voice sometimes. It was so convincing, so real. And sometimes late at night, I hear it again, whispering from the shadows of my room, calling me back to the woods. I've always been one for adventure, but this camping trip took a turn I'll never forget. It started with me, my buddy Dave, and my younger sister Emily. We'd been planning a weekend in the deep woods for months, a place isolated enough that we could escape the chaos of everyday life. This area was known for its pristine beauty and the vastness of its untouched wilderness, perfect for our little retreat. But when we got there, things started to feel off. The first sign came before we even hit the trailhead. A park ranger flagged us down as we parked our car and unloaded our gear. He was an older guy with weathered skin and a grizzled beard that looked like it had seen more nights under the stars than any of us could ever imagine. "You folks aren't thinking of heading up the ridge trail, are you?" he asked, eyeing us with a kind of worry that immediately set my nerves on edge. "We were," I replied. "Why? Is there something we should know?" He took a deep breath and looked at us, weighing his words. "Listen, I've been working these woods for over 30 years, and there are some parts best left alone, especially at night." His eyes seemed to drift, almost as if he could see something that wasn't there. "People go missing sometimes, they get lost, and sometimes they don't come back." We exchanged glances, part nervous, part excited. Dave smirked. "We'll be fine, man. We've got maps, GPS, all the gear." The ranger's face didn't soften. "Maps won't help you. GPS goes haywire in these parts. Just don't wander too far. And if you hear anything unusual, you turn right back. Understood?" With a reluctant nod, we assured him we'd be careful, and we set off into the woods. At first, everything seemed normal. The air was crisp, birds were chirping, and there wasn't a single soul in sight. We reached a spot by the creek as the sun was beginning to dip below the trees and set up our tents. I was excited, but as the light faded, that uneasy feeling started creeping back. The first night, I woke up to a strange noise. It sounded like something, or someone, walking around our camp, shuffling through the fallen leaves. I poked my head out of the tent, but saw nothing. I told myself it was probably just a deer, maybe a raccoon scavenging for food, and went back to sleep. The next morning I found tracks in the mud near the creek. They were huge, way too large to belong to any animal I knew of. They looked almost like human footprints, but distorted, twisted, as if whoever or whatever had made them was walking on broken bones. I called Dave and Emily over, and their reactions mirrored my own unease. "This doesn't look right," Emily whispered. "What kind of animal could make tracks like this?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that something was watching us. We spent the day exploring, but every time I glanced over my shoulder I could have sworn I saw shadows moving between the trees. That evening, as we were gathered around the fire, Dave suddenly fell silent, staring out into the darkness. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. We listened, straining our ears. There was a sound, like someone calling out, but it was faint, like it was coming from far away. It didn't sound quite human either. It was distorted, echoing through the trees. We thought it might be someone in trouble, but as we listened closer, we realized it was repeating, almost like it was mimicking us. It sounded eerily like Emily's voice, calling our names. Emily's face went pale. That can't be me. I'm right here." The fire crackled and a chill settled over our camp. That night, sleep was impossible. I kept hearing rustling outside, branches snapping, and that voice calling our names, getting closer and closer. By the time dawn broke, we were all on edge, exhausted but too terrified to stay. We decided to pack up and head back, but as we followed the trail, we realized it wasn't leading us back to the parking lot. Somehow, we'd gotten turned around, even though we'd followed the same path we'd taken the day before. The trees around us seemed to grow thicker, the shadows darker, and that's when we saw it. Standing a few yards away, partially obscured by the trees, was a figure. It looked human at first, but as it stepped into the light, we saw its face. It was a twisted version of Emily, like a sick parody, her eyes too large, her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. Its limbs were elongated, joints bending in ways they shouldn't. We froze, and I felt a chill run down my spine as it mimicked Emily's voice perfectly. "Why are you leaving so soon?" it crooned, stepping closer. Dave let out a scream, and we turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, no longer caring about finding the trail. We could hear it behind us, its footsteps heavy and relentless, that voice now blending with the sounds of the forest as if it were coming from every direction at once. Finally, we burst into a clearing and saw the ranger's cabin in the distance. We sprinted toward it, pounding on the door until he opened it, dragging us inside. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked, locking the door and peering out the window. He told us we'd been lucky to make it back, that the creature was a skinwalker or something like it, a being that could wear the faces of others and lure people deeper into the woods where they'd never be found again. We spent the night in his cabin, too shaken to speak. By morning, he escorted us back to the parking lot, and as we drove away, I glanced back one last time, half expecting to see that twisted face watching us from the trees. As we reached the main road, Emily turned to me, pale and trembling. Did you see my backpack in the cabin?" I shook my head, confused. "No. Why?" Her face went white. "I saw it on that thing. The same one I lost in the woods. Before we saw it." My blood ran cold. Emily had never mentioned losing her backpack, but I knew exactly what it meant. Whatever that thing was, it had been following us long before we knew it was there, and somehow, deep down, I had the sickening feeling it wasn't finished with us yet. I'd planned the trip for months, a solo camping adventure deep in the Appalachian woods. I wanted isolation, time away from screens, noise, and people. But by the time I reached my chosen spot, late afternoon shadows stretched long and thin between the trees, and a chill settled that felt different, wrong somehow. I had just set up my tent when I heard it. A snap, then a rustling, just beyond the tree line. It was too heavy to be a deer. I called out, hoping it was another hiker, but there was no reply, just the crackling of leaves and twigs underfoot, circling my campsite. Goosebumps prickled along my skin as I realized that whatever it was getting closer. I forced myself to stay calm and turned back to the fire, convincing myself it was just some animal. I was stirring the embers when a voice spoke from the darkness. "Not many folks come this deep into the woods," the man said, stepping into the firelight. He wore a ranger's uniform, but it looked oddly tattered, as if it hadn't been replaced in decades. His face was pale and drawn, with an unnatural sheen to his skin that made him look not quite real. "Yeah, I wanted some peace and quiet," I replied, trying to mask my unease. "Didn't expect anyone to find me out here." "Most don't, but you should know." He paused, his gaze flickering past me and into the trees. "These woods aren't as empty as they seem. Things live here that don't appreciate visitors, especially not after dark." "What kind of things?" I asked, forcing a laugh that didn't reach my eyes. "Creatures," he said, his voice lowering. "Cryptids, some people call them. Others just call them nightmares." He leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "If you see something tonight, don't stare. They don't like being looked at. And if you hear someone calling your name, know you didn't." Before I could reply, he was gone, blending into the shadows as if he'd never been there. I felt a tightness in my chest as I turned back to the fire. The silence around me was thicker now, almost oppressive. I tried to shake off the encounter, telling myself he was just trying to spook me. Hours passed and I forced myself to relax, even though I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Finally, exhaustion won, and I crawled into my tent. I was just drifting off when I heard it. My name, whispered in a voice that was almost mine, but just wrong. "Hey, you out there?" the voice called, soft and distant. My heart hammered in my chest and I lay frozen, every muscle tense. It was coming from the woods, moving around my camp in slow, deliberate circles. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, but it kept coming closer and closer, until it felt like the voice was right outside my tent. "Come on, I just want to talk," it said, mimicking my own tone, my own inflections, but with an edge that felt twisted, malevolent. I couldn't help myself. I looked. I slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek through the crack. And there it was, a figure standing just beyond the firelight, its shape almost human, but its eyes were hollow, empty, dark holes that seemed to suck in all the light around it. It was thin, almost skeletal, with skin stretched tight over its bones, and it wore a distorted, sickly grin that was too wide, too forced. The creature raised a bony finger to its lips, making a shushing motion, and then it began to laugh. The sound was hollow, echoing, filling the night with a dread that settled deep in my bones. I zipped the tent shut, my heart pounding. I wanted to run, but the ranger's warning echoed in my mind. Don't run. I forced myself to stay still, clutching the knife I'd brought for camp chores, my only feeble defense. The footsteps started again, circling my tent, pacing back and forth, and that twisted, echoing laughter followed me until dawn. I didn't sleep a wink. When the first light finally crept through the trees, the forest went silent again and I dared to step outside. My campsite was untouched, no sign of the night's horror. But as I packed up, ready to leave and never look back, I noticed something chilling. In the dirt just beyond the fire pit were 2 sets of tracks. One was mine. The other set was massive, clawed, and unearthly, trailing off into the woods as if something had followed me, watching, waiting. And just a few feet away, I found something even stranger. An old worn ranger's hat, lying on the ground, with a dark, rust-colored stain along the brim. I hiked out of those woods as fast as I could, feeling eyes on my back the entire way. When I got back to the trailhead, I stopped by the ranger station, desperate for answers. I described the man I'd seen, the worn uniform, the strange warnings. The ranger on duty looked at me with an odd expression. "There hasn't been a ranger stationed out there in years," he said, shaking his head. "Not since old Ranger Clemens disappeared back in '82. They say he got lost, or maybe the woods took him. But folks around here have seen him sometimes, wandering the trails, warning campers. Just don't know if he's trying to protect them, or lead them to whatever got him." I left, heart racing, trying to shake the feeling that I'd been lured out there for some twisted purpose. And as I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the ranger's face staring back at me, his hollow eyes boring into mine. But the seat was empty. Still, sometimes at night I hear that laughter echoing in the dark corners of my mind, reminding me that the woods don't forget, and neither do the things that live there. I've always loved the forest. I find peace in the way the trees stretch up into the sky, blocking out the world beyond. So when my friends backed out of our annual camping trip last minute, I decided to go alone. I figured a weekend in the deep woods would do me good. Some time away from the noise, away from the emails and the endless texts. I arrived just before dusk, parked my truck at the edge of the trail, and hoisted my pack over my shoulder. There's a certain thrill in walking through a dense forest with nothing but your instincts to guide you. I hadn't picked a specific campsite, just planned to wander until I found somewhere that felt right. A couple hours in, I found a small clearing surrounded by pines. I set up camp, got a fire going, and settled in as night fell. The forest seemed alive, the chorus of crickets and the distant hoots of owls filling the air. But it was the silence between those sounds that caught my attention. It was heavy, suffocating, like the woods were holding their breath. I was starting to drift off when I heard something moving, a snap of a branch, then another. I opened my eyes and scanned the edge of the clearing, but I didn't see anything. I brushed it off, figuring it was just an animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Just as I convinced myself it was nothing, I heard it. A low, guttural growl, too deep to be any animal I'd ever heard. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a pair of eyes reflecting back at me. They were too high off the ground to belong to a deer, too large to be anything else I could name. I fumbled for my knife, the only weapon I'd brought, and pointed it in the creature's direction. The eyes didn't move. They just stared, unblinking. The growling stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, as quickly as it had come, it was gone. The eyes blinked out, and I was left alone in the clearing. I didn't sleep much that night. I stayed by the fire, knife in hand, my back to a tree. The forest around me seemed to hold its breath, waiting. I thought about packing up and heading back to the truck, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. The next morning I was still on edge, but I pushed forward with my plan. I hiked deeper into the woods, hoping that if I put enough distance between me and whatever I'd seen, I'd feel better. As I walked, I noticed something strange. There were no birds, no squirrels, nothing. It was like the forest had been drained of life. Then, I stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to find. A small shack hidden between a cluster of trees. It looked abandoned, the windows broken, the door hanging off its hinges. Curiosity got the better of me, so I stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw strange symbols carved into the walls. Symbols I didn't recognize, but they made my skin crawl. In the center of the room was a table, and on it a faded map of the forest with strange markings. I studied it, trying to make sense of it, when I heard a noise behind me. I turned, and standing in the doorway was a park ranger, or at least it looked like a park ranger. His face was pale, his eyes dark, and there was something wrong about the way he stood, too still, like he wasn't breathing. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice a raspy whisper. "I was just exploring," I managed to stammer. He stepped into the room, his eyes never leaving mine. "This place isn't safe. You need to leave." There was no arguing with him. I nodded, grabbed my pack, and hurried out of the shack, my heart pounding in my chest. As I walked away, I glanced back and saw him watching me from the doorway, his face expressionless. I was more than ready to head back to my truck, but when I reached the trail, I realized I was lost. The map in my head didn't match what I was seeing. I could have sworn I'd followed the same path back, but the trees seemed to have shifted, the landscape foreign and unfamiliar. I tried to retrace my steps, but the deeper I went, the more the forest closed in around me. And then I saw them, the same eyes from the night before, watching me from the shadows. I backed away, heart racing, and that's when I heard footsteps, heavy, lumbering footsteps coming toward me. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I ran until my legs burned, until I couldn't breathe. I stumbled into another clearing, and there, standing in the center, was the park ranger. Only now I could see what was wrong with him. His skin was peeling away, revealing patches of fur and clawed hands. He wasn't human. Not anymore. He grinned, his teeth sharp and jagged. "You're not the first, you know. The forest takes what it wants." I turned to run, but something else blocked my path. It was tall, covered in matted fur, its face like a twisted blend of human and dog. The DOGMAN, they call it. Though seeing it in the flesh, it was so much worse than I'd imagined. Its eyes were the same as the ones I'd seen that first night. Cold, unblinking. They closed in on me, their voices echoing through the trees, whispering in a language I didn't understand. I knew then that I wasn't getting out. The forest had chosen me, and there was no escaping it. As they closed in, I remembered the symbols in the shack, the strange markings on the map. This place wasn't just any forest. It was a hunting ground, a place where creatures older than time lurked, waiting for their next victim. I'd wanted to be alone to escape the noise, but I didn't realize that out here, in the deep woods, alone was the last thing you wanted to be. And as the forest closed around me, I understood. This place wasn't just alive. It was hungry, and I was its next meal. I'd always heard that the woods could be dangerous. People would say the forest hides things better left unseen, but I never believed it. Until that night. My best friend Jake and I decided to go camping in the backwoods of West Virginia, miles from any town or even a dirt road. Jake was a skeptic, a real prove-it kind of guy, and he dared me to spend the weekend in one of the most remote parts of the forest. We'd stocked up on supplies, loaded our packs, and made our way in, laughing off all the old tales about skinwalkers and dogmen. We figured they were just campfire stories. The first day was normal enough. We set up camp, found a decent clearing, and built a fire. We spent the afternoon exploring the surrounding forest, marveling at how thick and ancient it all looked. The trees stood like giants, their bark gnarled and twisted, and there was a strange quietness, an eerie absence of life. No birds, no squirrels, just us and the whisper of the wind through the branches. That night, as we sat around the fire, things began to feel off. It started with the noises. A low, guttural growl sounded from somewhere just beyond the firelight. Jake froze, staring into the darkness, but we couldn't see anything. We laughed it off nervously, assuming it was just some animal. But the noises kept coming, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, and every now and then, that growl. We'd shine our flashlights into the woods, but there was nothing there, only the black void of the forest. We tried to sleep, but I kept waking up. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear something moving closer. Around 3 a.m., I heard a scratching sound right outside my tent. I reached for my flashlight, heart pounding, and unzipped the tent. My light caught a glimpse of something moving, something on 2 legs, hunched and covered in dark fur. It slinked away before I could get a good look, but its silhouette looked wrong, twisted, like a man whose bones didn't fit together right. In the morning, we found strange footprints around the campsite. They were massive, almost human, but not quite. The toes were elongated, and they had claws at the ends. Jake was freaked out, but he didn't want to admit it. He brushed it off as a bear or a wolf, but I could tell he was shaken. We decided to hike deeper into the woods, thinking that maybe we'd find some trace of the creature, or at least some comfort in daylight. But as we walked, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees grew closer together, their branches tangling overhead, blotting out the sun. And then we found the carvings. Dozens of trees had symbols carved into their bark, crude, almost ancient-looking glyphs that didn't match any language I'd seen before. Some of them looked like twisted faces. Others resembled animals or strange, unnatural shapes. There was something about them that made my skin crawl, like they were watching us. Jake was finally starting to feel the fear, too. I could see it in his eyes as he scanned the symbols, like he wanted to turn back but didn't want to seem scared. That night, the noises came back, but they were louder and closer. Something was moving just beyond the reach of the firelight. I could see shadows darting between the trees, and every now and then, a pair of glowing eyes would catch the light, staring at us with an intelligence that felt almost human. Then came the howls, long drawn-out wails that seemed to echo through the forest, getting closer and closer. Jake decided to go check it out. He grabbed his flashlight and walked toward the edge of the clearing, shouting into the darkness, demanding that whatever it was show itself. I wanted to stop him, but my legs felt like lead. I watched as he vanished into the shadows, his flashlight beam bobbing among the trees. Then the light went out, and everything went silent. I called his name, but there was no answer. I was alone, trapped in the clearing, surrounded by whatever lurked in the woods. Then in the distance I saw something moving, a figure, tall, lanky, with glowing eyes. It looked like Jake. But as it stepped closer, I saw its face, and it was wrong, twisted, elongated, like something was wearing his skin but hadn't quite figured out how to fit inside it. It moved toward me, its limbs jerking awkwardly like a puppet on broken strings. I stumbled back, falling onto the cold ground, and as it came closer, I saw that its eyes were empty, just hollow black pits. Then it spoke in Jake's voice, but distorted, like an echo of a memory. It said, "Come with us. Join us." I scrambled to my feet and ran. I didn't look back, not even when I heard it running after me, crashing through the underbrush with that unnatural gait. I don't remember much of the run back, only that I kept moving, fueled by pure terror. When I finally burst out of the woods, the sun was rising, and I was alone. I went back with a search party the next day, but there was no trace of Jake, no campsite, no footprints, nothing. The trees stood silent and unyielding, as if they'd swallowed him whole. I told them what I saw, but they didn't believe me. They said he must have gotten lost, maybe fell into a ravine or ran off. But I know the truth. He didn't run. Something took him, something that wears the faces of those it claims. And now sometimes late at night I hear his voice outside my window, calling my name, telling me to come back to the woods. But I won't. I know better now. Some things in the forest are better left unseen. I had always considered myself an outdoorsman. I loved the feeling of isolation, the whisper of the trees, and the cool, undisturbed air of the forest. So, when I heard about the quiet beauty of Blackwood Forest, I packed my tent and supplies, ready for a weekend of solitude and reflection. But Blackwood Forest, it was unlike any place I'd ever been. It's been weeks since I returned, but the memories cling to me, their weight sinking into my bones, their chill invading my nights. The first sign that something was wrong came as the last light of day drained from the sky. I had set up my camp in a small clearing, nestled between towering pines that seemed to lean in on me, as though curious about this stranger in their midst. The forest was deathly silent, more so than any place I'd ever been. No rustle of animals, no chirping of birds, just the stillness pressing in on all sides. It was then I first noticed the smell, a faint rotting odor, like something that had died and been left to fester. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just the forest playing tricks on me, my mind conjuring smells out of the thick, humid air. But it lingered, following me as I set up my tent and built a small fire. I ate in silence, my senses on high alert, but I saw nothing unusual. The silence seemed to deepen, and every crackle of the fire sounded like a gunshot, reverberating through the trees. I tried to shake the unease, chalking it up to nerves, but then came the footsteps. They started faint, almost imperceptible, just a soft crunching in the underbrush. I turned quickly, peering into the darkness beyond the fire's reach, but there was nothing there. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, maybe just a figment of my imagination, but the steps didn't stop. They circled my campsite, slow and deliberate, pausing every few steps as though whoever or whatever it was wanted me to know they were there. I reached for my flashlight and swept it across the trees, but the beam seemed to only deepen the shadows, stretching them into grotesque shapes that danced on the edge of my vision. I held my breath, listening, and for a moment there was silence. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, so deep that I felt it in my chest. It was followed by a strange clicking sound, like claws tapping on stone. My heart pounded, and I took a shaky step back, my mind racing with fear. Suddenly, I saw a figure dart between the trees, too fast to make out any details. But it was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that moved in a way that was wrong, bending and twisting as though they had too many joints. My blood turned to ice as I watched it disappear into the darkness, the smell of rot growing stronger, almost choking me. I stumbled back to the fire, clutching my flashlight as though it could protect me. The footsteps started again, now louder, closer, and I could hear faint whispers mixed in with the growls, words that I couldn't quite make out. Panic gripped me, and I fumbled for my phone, desperate for some connection to the outside world. But of course, there was no signal. I was alone, truly alone, with whatever horror lurked in the trees. As I frantically searched for something, anything that might help me, I noticed a figure approaching from the shadows. It was a park ranger, his uniform dirty and torn, his eyes wide and staring. Relief flooded through me, and I called out to him, but he didn't respond. He simply stood there, watching me with an expression that was almost pitying. "They don't like outsiders," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "You need to leave. Now." Before I could ask him what he meant, he turned and vanished into the woods, moving with a speed that seemed unnatural, almost inhuman. I scrambled to pack up my things, my hands shaking as the growls grew louder and the footsteps closed in around me. I didn't look back as I ran, the darkness pressing in on all sides, the feeling of being watched gnawing at me with every step. As I burst from the trees, I found myself on an unfamiliar trail, but I didn't stop to question it. I just kept running, desperate to escape the unseen horrors that lurked in the forest. But as I neared the edge of the woods, something caught my eye, a small wooden sign, half hidden by vines and dirt. I brushed it off, hoping for some clue about where I was, but what I saw made my blood run cold. It was a weathered photograph of a man in a park ranger uniform, smiling at the camera. Beneath it, a date was scrawled in faded ink. It was from 1975, the same man I had just seen in the woods, the one who had warned me to leave. His eyes stared back at me from the photograph, hollow and empty. I turned and ran, the ranger's words echoing in my mind, and behind me, I heard the growls and whispers resume, louder than before. The forest seemed to close in, the trees bending toward me, their twisted limbs reaching, grasping as though they wanted to keep me there forever. And now, even in the safety of my home, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched. I never did find Blackwood Forest on any map, and sometimes late at night I swear I hear footsteps outside my window, slow and deliberate, circling, waiting. And now, even in the safety of my home, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched. I never did find Blackwood Forest on any map, and sometimes late at night, I swear I hear footsteps outside my window, slow and deliberate, circling, waiting. As I trudged deeper into the forest, the towering pines grew closer together, their jagged branches clawing at the dimming sky. My name's Mark, and I've been a park ranger in these woods for over a decade, but tonight, as darkness settled in, the place felt different, colder, more ominous. I was used to the sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, the hoot of an owl, even the occasional rustle of a bear. But tonight, the silence was thick and oppressive, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I'd been called out after reports of strange sounds echoing from the eastern quadrant of the park. People said they'd heard voices out here, somewhere past the old fire lookout, where the trees grow so thick they almost blot out the sun, even at noon. The voices, they said, didn't belong to any person. They were whispers that drifted on the wind, carrying words that chilled the soul. A few hikers had gone missing last week, but the search had turned up nothing. Their tents were found abandoned, the contents strewn around like a hurricane had passed through, but there were no tracks, no signs of a struggle. Just nothing. I knew better than to believe in campfire tales, but something about the woods tonight felt alive, as if it had woken up and was watching me with hungry eyes. I should have radioed for backup. The thought crossed my mind, but the walkie-talkie was dead, its battery drained despite being fully charged this morning. Typical. I shrugged it off and kept going, my flashlight barely piercing the shadows. The trail narrowed as I pressed on, the underbrush thickening around me. Shadows twisted into shapes at the edge of my vision, but every time I turned, they disappeared, leaving only the rustle of leaves and the creak of old trees in their wake. I told myself it was just my imagination, but my skin prickled with every step. It wasn't long before I caught a whiff of something rancid, like spoiled meat left out in the sun. I covered my nose and looked around, but the darkness was almost impenetrable now. My flashlight flickered, and I smacked it against my palm, whispering a curse under my breath. The light sputtered back to life, but barely. I was losing faith in my cheap gear when I heard it, a low, guttural growl from somewhere ahead. It wasn't the growl of a bear or a wolf. It was deeper, almost a rumble that seemed to vibrate the ground beneath my feet. My gut twisted with fear, but I forced myself to move forward, telling myself it was just an animal, nothing more. Then I saw it. Standing in a small clearing, illuminated by the pale moonlight, was a figure. At first glance it looked human, a man with broad shoulders, long arms, and a head cocked to the side, almost as if he were waiting for me to speak. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized there was something horribly wrong. His skin was stretched too tight over his bones, pulling his face into a grotesque mask of twisted features. His eyes glowed faintly, like two embers burning in the sockets, and his mouth was stretched into a wide grin that showed rows of jagged teeth. "Hello?" I croaked, my voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't move, but the grin widened, and a shiver raced down my spine. It wasn't a man. Not anymore. I took a step back, and that's when I saw it. Another one, lurking in the shadows, its eyes glinting as it crouched low to the ground. And another, off to the left, sniffing the air as it crept closer. They moved with an unnatural grace, like predators circling me, their eyes never leaving my face. I was surrounded. Panicking, I spun around and broke into a run, crashing through the underbrush, my breath ragged in my throat. I could hear them following, their footsteps soft but relentless, keeping pace with me no matter how fast I ran. I stumbled over a root, catching myself just in time, but I knew I couldn't keep this up forever. I burst into another clearing and stopped dead in my tracks. In front of me, perched on a rock, was the creature I'd seen first. Only now, it was hunched over, its arms long and sinewy, ending in claws that scraped against the stone. Its head turned slowly, impossibly, to face me, the bones cracking and popping as it moved. "What are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The creature opened its mouth, and what came out was a garbled mess of sounds like a tape recorder playing backward, mingling fragments of words I could barely understand. Lost. Alone. Hungry. The words twisted in the air, wrapping around me like a shroud. My heart thundered in my chest as I backed away, realizing too late that I had no idea which way I'd come from. The trees all looked the same, their gnarled trunks and tangled branches forming a maze that was impossible to navigate. The creature laughed, a guttural sound that made my blood turn to ice. I turned and ran again, but it was no use. They were everywhere now, shadows darting between the trees, eyes glinting in the darkness. I stumbled, tripping over something soft, and when I looked down, my blood ran cold. It was a pile of clothes, torn and bloody, scattered across the forest floor. I recognized the patch on the jacket, the emblem of the park. It belonged to Jake, my colleague who had gone missing last month. My mind reeled as I realized the truth. They weren't just creatures. They were wearing the skins of the people who had disappeared, their bodies twisted and deformed, but somehow, horribly, still alive beneath the surface. I stumbled backward, feeling the bile rise in my throat, but there was nowhere to go. The creatures closed in, their eyes gleaming with hunger. I was surrounded, and there was no escape. And then as I prepared for the end, I heard it, a voice, faint and distant, calling my name. I looked up, and there, just beyond the trees, was a light, faint but steady. It was the fire lookout. I was close. If I could just make it there, I might have a chance. With a final burst of energy, I lunged forward, racing toward the light, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I reached the clearing, I skidded to a halt. The fire lookout was there, but it was empty. The door hung open, swinging on its hinges, and the light was flickering. I stepped inside, and that's when I saw the reflection in the window. It wasn't my face staring back at me. It was a face stretched and twisted, with eyes that glowed like embers and a mouth that grinned too wide. I looked down at my hands, and they were claws, long and sharp, coated in blood. I was one of them now. I'd been one of them all along, and I was hungry. It was supposed to be a routine check. Just another weekend in the deep woods, a few miles off the marked trails where campers like to disappear for some solitude. I'd been a park ranger here for almost 10 years, so I knew these woods like the back of my hand. But there was something about that night that just didn't sit right with me. The air was unusually still, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. No animal sounds, no wind through the trees, just silence, thick enough that it almost felt like it was pressing in on me. The sky was an odd, bruised color, even though it was past midnight. My flashlight was dimmer than usual, and I had the creeping feeling I was being watched. There was a campsite nearby that had been marked as problematic on the map. Last week, a group of campers had reported strange noises, but nothing came of it. I figured it was just coyotes or maybe a black bear, but protocol said I had to check it out. As I approached the site, I noticed the remains of a fire pit. Charred logs lay scattered as if they'd been kicked over in a hurry. The tents were still there, though, empty, flapping slightly in the faint breeze that had finally picked up. Something crunched beneath my boot, and I looked down to see a scattering of bones. Rabbit, maybe, or squirrel. But the bones were cracked and splintered in a way that suggested something had gnawed on them. I bent down to inspect them, and that's when I saw the footprints. They were large, misshapen, more like paw prints than anything human, but with elongated toes that ended in sharp, claw-like marks. I'd never seen anything like it. My radio crackled to life, making me jump. "Ranger Callahan, do you copy?" The voice was faint, distorted, but recognizable. It was Stephen, my partner, who was stationed on the other side of the park that night. "Copy, Stephen. You seeing this too?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause. "Seeing what?" I was going to ask if you heard the howling. Howling. I hadn't heard anything. But as I straightened up, I did hear something, a soft, low growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I whipped my flashlight around, but the beam only caught shadows that stretched and twisted between the trees. It felt like they were moving, slithering toward me. "Stephen, you there?" I called into the radio, but there was nothing but static. I turned to head back toward the trail, but I froze in my tracks. Standing a few yards away was a figure, tall and gaunt, its outline barely visible in the dim light. It looked almost human, but the limbs were all wrong, too long, too thin, and the head was tilted at an unnatural angle. "Hey!" I shouted, more out of desperation than anything else. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me. My flashlight flickered, and in that split second of darkness, the figure was suddenly closer. I felt a chill race up my spine. I took a step back, heart pounding, and tried to keep my distance as I circled around, keeping my flashlight trained on it. But the thing kept advancing, slow and methodical, until I could finally see its face, or rather, lack of one. There were no eyes, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin stretched taut over a skull. I tried to scream, but my throat was dry, frozen. Without thinking, I turned and ran, branches clawing at my face as I crashed through the underbrush. The thing was right behind me. I could hear its footsteps pounding in sync with my own heartbeat. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. I stumbled, falling hard against the roots of a massive tree. My radio clattered out of my hand, but before I could reach for it, I heard that voice again. Only this time, it was Stephen's voice. Except different. "Callahan," it whispered, but it was raspy, broken, like someone was trying to speak through a mouthful of gravel. "Come back. You don't belong here." I scrambled back, gasping as I saw not one, but 3 of those things emerging from the shadows, each one more twisted and unnatural than the last. They moved in sync, their heads cocked at odd angles as if they were studying me, deciding what to do next. But then they stopped, sniffing the air, and I realized I wasn't their focus anymore. I heard a shrill scream echo through the woods, Stephen's voice, unmistakable this time, coming from somewhere far off in the trees. They snapped toward the sound, their heads jerking unnaturally, before they vanished into the darkness, leaving nothing but an unnatural silence in their wake. I didn't wait around to see if they'd come back. Somehow I managed to stumble my way back to the main trail, tripping and scraping my knees on rocks and branches, until I saw the faint glow of the ranger station. I burst inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it, my heart still racing. I radioed for backup, but when they arrived there was no sign of Stephen. We combed the woods for hours, calling his name, but there was nothing, not even a footprint. They finally called off the search, and Stephen was officially listed as missing. But I knew better. I never went back to that part of the forest again, but sometimes when the wind is just right, I can still hear that twisted version of his voice calling out from the depths of the woods. A chilling reminder that some things aren't meant to be found. And those who go looking, they don't come back. The forest was unnervingly quiet as I made my way down the trail. My name's Jack, and I'd been a park ranger here in the Pacific Northwest for years. I thought I'd seen it all: storms, animal attacks, even a few close calls with poachers. But nothing had prepared me for what I encountered that night. It started with the disappearances. First, it was a group of hikers who never came back. Then, a local who went for a run and vanished without a trace. Each time we searched, we'd come up empty. No tracks, no signs of struggle, just the unsettling sense that they had simply ceased to exist. Tonight I was alone, making a last sweep before we called off the search for the day. The sky was a deep indigo, and the trees cast long shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe in the moonlight. The air was thick with the scent of pine, but there was something else too, something metallic, like the tang of blood. I reached a clearing and paused. In the center of it was something that made my blood run cold, a crude, makeshift altar made of twisted branches and bones. Animal skulls adorned the corners, their hollow eyes staring out into the dark. A feeling of dread washed over me, and I took a step back, instinctively reaching for the radio on my belt. But the static that met my ears told me I was cut off. Typical. Out here, you could never count on a signal. I turned to leave when I heard it, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to rise up from the ground itself. I froze, straining to make out the words, but they were in a language I didn't recognize. The voice was close, far too close, yet I couldn't see anyone. And then, just beyond the edge of the clearing, I saw them. Figures, pale and elongated, standing motionless among the trees. They looked almost human, but their limbs were too long, their fingers too slender and sharp like twisted claws. They were draped in tattered clothing that seemed to hang off their skeletal frames, and their faces. I don't think I'll ever forget their faces. Hollow eyes, mouths twisted into unnatural smiles, as if they were mocking me. One of them took a step forward, its bare feet making no sound on the forest floor. I took a step back, my hand reaching for the gun at my hip. But as I pulled it free, I realized with a sickening lurch that the creature had vanished. They all had. The forest was empty again, but the air was charged with a malevolent energy that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I backed away, turning to head down the trail, when I heard the whisper again, louder this time. It was my name. Jack. I spun around, the gun raised, but there was no one there. Just the trees, their branches creaking as they swayed in the wind. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself it was just the wind, just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, a chorus of whispers now, all calling my name, coming from every direction. I took off down the trail, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I didn't look back. I knew I wouldn't see anything, even if I did. I just had to get to the ranger station, where the light and the radio would be, where I could call for help. The trees seemed to close in around me, their shadows stretching out like claws. I stumbled over a root, nearly falling, and as I regained my balance, I felt a cold hand brush against my arm. I whipped around, but there was nothing, just the shadows shifting and twisting. I broke into a sprint, my lungs burning as I pushed through the underbrush. The whispers were everywhere now, louder and more insistent, overlapping into a cacophony that drowned out my own thoughts. I could feel them closing in, their cold fingers brushing against my skin, tugging at me, pulling me back into the darkness. And then, just when I thought I couldn't run any farther, I saw it. The warm glow of the ranger station, barely visible through the trees. I stumbled toward it, bursting through the door and slamming it shut behind me. I flicked on the lights and the warm, reassuring glow filled the room. The whisper stopped. I collapsed into a chair, my hands shaking as I tried to catch my breath. I reached for the radio, but all I heard was static. I tried to tune it, hoping to get a signal, but there was nothing. Just that eerie, crackling static. I glanced around the room, trying to calm myself. But then I noticed something odd. The walls of the station were covered in maps and notes from past searches. But now, in the dim light, I could see something else, faint scrawled words, almost invisible in the shadows. I leaned in, squinting to read them, and my heart sank as I realized what they said. "Help me, Jack. They're coming for you." The words were written in a dozen different hands, each one more frantic than the last. I took a step back, and that's when I saw it, a reflection in the window, a figure standing right behind me. Pale, elongated, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. I spun around, but the room was empty. And then I understood. The whispers, the creatures, the altar. It wasn't just some supernatural encounter. It was a warning. The people who had vanished, the ones I'd been searching for, they hadn't disappeared. They'd become part of the forest, transformed into those twisted, hollow figures, trapped in an endless cycle of torment. I looked back at the window, and for a split second, I saw my own reflection there, grinning back at me with hollow eyes. The static on the radio cut out, replaced by a familiar, chilling whisper. "Welcome home, Jack." And in that moment I knew I wasn't going to leave these woods, not as myself. The forest had taken me, just as it had taken all the others, and now I was one of them. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the kind of cold that bites deep, sinking its teeth into bone. I clutched my jacket tighter around me, cursing my decision to camp alone in the vast, remote stretch of forest that locals called the Blackwood. My name's Sarah, and I've been camping solo for years, but something about these woods set my nerves on edge. I'd heard stories of strange creatures and unnatural sightings around here, but I'd brushed them off as old wives' tales, until tonight. I'd set up camp by the lake, where the water lay still as glass, reflecting the towering pines like a mirror. The sun had slipped below the horizon hours ago, and now only the feeble glow of my campfire kept the darkness at bay. But the firelight felt thin, too weak to push back the creeping shadows that pressed in from all sides. The woods were eerily quiet, save for the occasional crackle of branches, as if something were moving, just out of sight. The first sign that something was wrong came when I noticed the forest was completely silent. No crickets, no owls, not even the soft rustling of leaves. Just an unnatural, oppressive quiet that made my skin prickle. I tried to shake off the feeling, chalking it up to an overactive imagination, but then I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting between the trees fast and low. I stood, scanning the edge of the firelight, but there was nothing there. Just trees, their black silhouettes stretching up into the night. I took a deep breath, telling myself I was being paranoid, and settled back down. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. It felt like something was lurking just beyond the circle of light, waiting for me to drop my guard. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness, sweeping the beam across the trees. For a moment, I saw nothing. And then, just as I was about to turn off the light, something moved. A pair of eyes, yellow and unblinking, stared back at me from the shadows. They were set too high up, higher than any animal I'd ever seen, and as I watched, the creature stepped forward. It was massive, its body covered in shaggy, matted fur that seemed to blend with the night. Its face was elongated, almost like a dog's, but twisted and distorted, with too many teeth glinting in the flashlight's beam. A dogman. I'd heard the legends, but seeing one up close was a different kind of terror altogether. My heart hammered in my chest as I took a step back, my legs shaking. The creature didn't move, just stood there, watching me with those yellow eyes. And then, without warning, it let out a low growl that sent a shiver down my spine. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight, and scrambled to grab my backpack, throwing it over my shoulder. I didn't look back as I took off into the woods, running as fast as I could, the darkness closing in around me. Branches clawed at my face and arms as I pushed through the underbrush, not daring to slow down. I could hear it behind me, the sound of heavy footfalls and snapping branches growing closer. I veered off the trail, hoping to lose it, but the creature followed, its growls echoing through the trees. I saw a flash of light up ahead, a cabin half hidden by the trees. I sprinted toward it, desperate for any kind of shelter. I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me and locking it, my breath ragged in my throat. The cabin was dark and smelled of damp wood, but I didn't care. It was shelter. I stood there pressing my back against the door, listening to the silence. I heard the creature outside, pacing, its claws scraping against the walls. But it didn't try to break in. It just circled the cabin, like it was waiting for something. My eyes adjusted to the darkness and I took in the cabin. It was small, barely more than one room, with a cot against one wall and a small table in the center. There was an old hunting rifle propped up against the wall. I grabbed it, checking the chamber. 1 bullet. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and peered out the window. The creature was gone. The forest outside was empty, but I knew it was still out there waiting. I had to get out of here. I couldn't stay holed up in this cabin all night. I unlocked the door, stepping out into the night, the rifle clutched tight in my hands. I started back toward the trail, moving as quietly as I could, but every step felt like a death sentence. The silence was deafening, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. And then I heard it, a soft whisper, carried on the wind. "Sarah." I froze, my heart pounding. I looked around, but there was no one there. Just trees, stretching endlessly in every direction. I took a step forward, and the whisper came again, louder this time. "Sarah." It wasn't the creature. It was a voice, familiar and chilling, like someone I'd known long ago. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog from my mind, but the voice was inside me now, wrapping around my thoughts, twisting them. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. I was losing myself. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw them, figures moving between the trees, shadowy and indistinct. They looked human, but there was something wrong with them, something that made my skin crawl. They moved in jerky, unnatural motions, like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. "Sarah." The voice was louder now, a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I raised the rifle, aiming into the darkness, but the figures kept coming, their empty eyes fixed on me. I fired, the shot echoing through the trees, but when the smoke cleared, there was nothing, just shadows and silence. I backed away, but the figures were closing in, their faces contorted into horrible, mocking grins. I could feel their eyes on me, piercing through me, as if they could see into the darkest corners of my soul. And then, suddenly, I was falling. I hit the ground hard, the breath knocked out of me, and when I looked up, I was back by the lake, staring into the water. But something was wrong. The reflection staring back at me wasn't mine. It was a face twisted and hollow, with eyes that burned like fire. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The reflection reached up, a hand stretching toward me from beneath the surface, and I felt its cold grip around my wrist, pulling me down. The last thing I saw was the twisted, grinning face, its mouth opening wide as it swallowed me whole. And then there was only darkness. They found my campsite the next morning, my gear scattered around the lake. They said I'd wandered too far, that I must have gotten lost in the dark. But they didn't see the eyes, the shadows, the face that wasn't mine. Now, when the wind howls through the blackwood, people say they hear a whisper, a name carried on the breeze. "Sarah." And I'm still out here waiting for someone to join me in the darkness. I was a park ranger in the Sanford National Forest, a thick sprawl of pines and oaks that stretched for miles into the mountains. People said there was something strange about the place. They'd say the forest was alive in a way that didn't feel right, like it was watching, waiting. I'd heard the tales about things out here, skinwalkers, dogmen, things that shifted in the dark. I never believed them, until that night. It was late October and the air was sharp with the smell of fallen leaves and damp earth. A storm had passed through the day before, leaving the ground slick and the skies bruised. I'd been tasked with checking one of the farthest campsites, Camp Raven, about 5 miles from the nearest road. It was isolated, nestled deep in a hollow where the trees grew so dense they blocked out the sky. As I hiked, I could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on me. The trees loomed, their branches twisting and gnarled like skeletal hands reaching out. Every now and then, a bird would caw, the sound echoing off into the distance, but otherwise it was quiet. Too quiet. I tried to shake the feeling, reminding myself that it was just the solitude getting to me. But then I heard it. a low growl, distant but distinct. I froze, ears straining. There it was again, closer this time. I couldn't place it. Too deep for a wolf, too guttural for a bear. My mind flashed to the stories, the whispered warnings about creatures that didn't belong in our world. I pushed the thought away, took a deep breath, and kept moving. By the time I reached Camp Raven, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky a sickly orange. The place was deserted, as expected. But something was wrong. The fire pit was cold, untouched for days, but the ground around it was torn up like something had clawed at it. I bent down, my flashlight cutting through the fading light, and that's when I saw them. Tracks. Massive, clawed prints that sank deep into the earth. They led from the campsite and disappeared into the woods. I stood there, my heart hammering in my chest, staring into the trees. The shadows seemed to move, twisting into shapes that weren't quite natural. I should have turned back. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of there, but something compelled me forward, as if an invisible thread was pulling me deeper into the forest. I followed the tracks, my flashlight bobbing as I stepped over roots and ducked under branches. The air grew colder, and a thick fog crept along the ground, curling around my legs. I could barely see 10 feet ahead, but the tracks were unmistakable, leading me onward. Then I saw it. A figure, hunched and twisted, stood in a small clearing. Its back was to me, its shape shrouded in mist. At first I thought it was a man, but as I stepped closer I realized it was something else entirely. Its limbs were too long, its skin stretched tight over jutting bones. And then it turned. The face that stared back at me wasn't human. Its eyes were too large, glistening in the beam of my flashlight, black as oil. The skin was taut, pale, almost translucent, revealing a network of veins pulsing beneath the surface. And its mouth, God, that mouth, was wide, stretching impossibly, rows of jagged teeth glinting in the dim light. It moved then, faster than I could react, skittering around the edge of the clearing, never taking its eyes off me. I stumbled back, my foot catching on a root, and I went down hard, the breath knocked from my lungs. The creature loomed over me, and I knew with a sickening certainty that I was going to die. But then it spoke. Its voice was a rasp, like dead leaves scraping together. "You're not meant to be here," it said, each word a guttural snarl. "You've seen too much." I scrambled backward, my hands clawing at the dirt, trying to put distance between us. But it didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, as if savoring my fear. And then it shifted, its form blurring, melting, until it was no longer a twisted creature but a man, a mirror image of myself. Every detail was exact, down to the terrified expression on its face. I stared, unable to process what I was seeing, and then it turned and walked away, disappearing into the fog as if it had never been there. For a long time I lay there, the silence pressing in, my mind racing. When I finally got to my feet, I ran, not stopping until I reached the edge of the forest. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that it had to be a trick of the light, my imagination running wild. But deep down I knew the truth. Because when I reached the ranger station, there was someone already there, standing in the doorway, waiting for me. It was me, or rather it looked like me, every detail the same, from the mud-stained uniform to the scar above my left eyebrow. It smiled, a slow, chilling grin, and in that moment, I knew. I had left something behind in that forest, and whatever had followed me out, it wasn't me anymore. I've always loved the solitude of the woods. It's where I feel most at home, away from the noise and chaos of civilization. As a park ranger, I spend most of my days patrolling trails, checking campsites, and occasionally rescuing lost hikers. But it was my days off that I cherished the most, when I could venture deep into the forest, far beyond where any hiker would dare to go. This time, I decided to camp out near a secluded lake I'd found on a map, miles from the nearest trail. I planned to spend a quiet night under the stars, just me and the wild. The sun was sinking below the tree line as I set up my tent, casting the woods in a dusky glow. The air was cool and smelled of pine, and the only sound was the gentle rustling of leaves. I built a small fire and settled in, feeling the weight of the week slip away. My flashlight lay beside me, just in case, though I doubted I'd need it. I knew these woods like the back of my hand, but as the darkness crept in, an unsettling feeling started to gnaw at me. It was as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, watching, waiting. Around midnight I heard it, the first sound that made my skin crawl. It was faint, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. A low, guttural growl echoed from the shadows beyond the firelight. I froze, straining my ears, trying to make sense of it. My mind raced through the possibilities. A coyote, maybe a wolf. But this sounded different, deeper. It didn't belong. I scanned the tree line with my flashlight, sweeping it back and forth, but saw nothing. The fire crackled, throwing twisted shadows against the trees, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I'd heard stories before, tales around the campfire about creatures that lived in these woods. The old ones called them skinwalkers, beings that could take the shape of animals or even other people. I'd never given much thought to them, until now. The growl came again, closer this time. My flashlight flickered and I cursed under my breath, giving it a shake. When it came back on, I could have sworn I saw something, a figure, hunched and twisted, slipping behind a tree. It moved unnaturally, as if it was struggling to walk upright. I stood up, heart pounding, and called out, hoping to scare it off. But my voice sounded small, swallowed by the thick, suffocating darkness. And then I heard it, a voice. It was Miney, calling back to me from the woods. "Help! Help me!" It cried, mimicking my tone exactly. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized it was coming from the direction I had seen that figure. I knew deep down that it wasn't human. I had heard tales of the skinwalker's mimicry, its ability to replicate voices to lure its victims. I had always dismissed it as superstition, but standing there, surrounded by darkness, I wasn't so sure anymore. The voice kept calling, growing louder, more insistent. "Help! Over here!" it wailed, each word dripping with a twisted mockery. I knew I should run, that I should get out of there as fast as possible. But something held me in place. A morbid curiosity, a need to know what lay beyond the darkness. Slowly I stepped away from the fire, flashlight shaking in my hand. The voice continued, repeating my own desperate cries, each one more distorted than the last. I moved forward, feeling the cold air wrap around me like a shroud, suffocating, stifling. I reached the spot where I had seen the figure, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. And then from behind me I heard footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate, echoing through the silence. I spun around and there it was, standing just outside the glow of the firelight. It looked like a man, but its limbs were too long, its posture too hunched. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, reflecting the flickering flames. It wore my face. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. I tried to speak, to demand answers, but the words caught in my throat. The creature grinned, a twisted smile that stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. It opened its mouth, and in my own voice it whispered, "I've been waiting for you." Panic surged through me, and I turned to run, crashing through the underbrush, branches clawing at my face and arms. Behind me I could hear it following, its footsteps matching mine, mirroring my every move. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the lake, breath ragged, heart hammering in my chest. I looked around, desperate, but there was nowhere to hide, nowhere to escape. The creature stood across the water, staring at me with those glowing eyes, its face still a grotesque mask of my own. And then it stepped forward, its body rippling, shifting. As it moved, it shed my likeness, transforming into a creature of shadows and twisted limbs. I watched in horror as it sank to all fours, its bones cracking and snapping, morphing into the shape of a massive wolf, its fur matted and dark. It let out a howl that shattered the silence, a sound that seemed to pierce my very soul. I knew in that moment that there was no escaping it. I had ventured too deep, strayed too far into its domain. The legends were true, and I was nothing more than another victim, another story to be told around the campfire. As the creature moved toward me, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. Maybe this was how it was meant to end, alone in the woods, swallowed by the darkness. The last thing I saw was its yellow eyes staring into mine before everything went black. Now I'm not sure where I am. I wander these woods, a ghostly echo of the man I used to be, trapped between the trees, forever bound to this place. Sometimes I hear the hikers passing by and I call out to them, hoping they'll come closer, hoping they'll see me. But they never do. And maybe that's for the best. It's strange, really, how the woods seem to close in on you once the sun dips below the tree line. I'd been a park ranger for over a decade, and I'd seen plenty of strange things, heard my share of unsettling stories. But this was something else. I'd decided to camp out for a few nights, deep in the heart of the forest, far from the usual trails and picnic spots. No one knew these woods like I did, or so I thought. I brought the essentials: a tent, a flashlight, and my old hunting knife. I wanted a break from the radio chatter, the endless updates from the park's main station. Out here, I could get some peace, surrounded by towering pines and the whisper of the wind. It was on the second night that things started feeling off. The fire crackled low, casting long shadows that danced across the trees, and as I sat staring into the flames, I felt it. An odd sensation, like I was being watched. I shook it off, thinking maybe a deer had wandered close. But then I heard it, a low guttural sound from somewhere in the darkness. It wasn't the kind of noise a deer would make. This was deep, almost a growl, but with a rasping undertone that prickled my skin. I scanned the edge of the firelight with my flashlight, half expecting to see nothing. But my beam landed on something just for a split second, and it moved too quickly to catch, darting behind a tree. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen, thin, long limbs, pale as moonlight, with eyes that reflected back like shards of glass. I stood up, heart hammering, straining my ears for any sound, but the woods were dead silent now, unnaturally so. Even the usual nighttime symphony of crickets and owls had gone mute, as if they too were holding their breath. I cursed under my breath and tried to shake it off. It was probably just the shadows playing tricks, I told myself. I'd been out here long enough to know the mind could conjure strange things in the dark. I settled back down, poking at the fire to give it some life. I was trying to calm my nerves when I heard it again, that growling rasp, closer this time. Every instinct told me to get out of there, to leave the fire and head back to the ranger station. But I stayed. I don't know why, but something kept me rooted, like my own curiosity was shackling me to that spot. I stood up and scanned the woods again, but now the trees seemed to close in, forming a solid wall of darkness. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement again, something crawling on all fours, slipping between the trees like it belonged there, yet everything about it felt wrong. Its limbs were too long, bending at unnatural angles, and its skin was too smooth, almost like polished bone. It didn't look like any creature I knew, and yet there was something familiar about it that made my blood run cold. I tried to focus on its shape, but every time I thought I had it pinned down, it shifted, like it was melting into the shadows only to reappear somewhere else. I could feel its eyes on me, unblinking, watching with a hunger that made my skin crawl. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sounding weak against the suffocating silence. The thing stopped, just at the edge of the firelight. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. For a moment, I thought maybe it was gone. But then I saw its eyes, gleaming like twin embers, fixed on me with an intensity that felt almost human. And then it spoke. Not in words exactly, but in a whisper that seemed to come from the trees themselves, filling the air with a hiss that twisted and curled around me. It felt like a warning, like it was trying to tell me something I couldn't understand. And that's when I felt it, a sudden searing pain in my chest, like ice-cold claws digging into my heart. I stumbled back, gasping, clutching at my chest, but there was nothing there. The thing was gone, the shadows empty once more. But the pain lingered, a cold ache that settled deep into my bones, and I knew then that whatever that thing was, it had marked me. The rest of the night passed in a blur of shadows and whispers. I barely slept, and when dawn finally broke, I packed up and headed back to the station, desperate to leave that cursed spot behind. I thought I was safe once I reached the station, but the forest followed me back. I started hearing things, seeing things. Shadows that slithered along the walls, whispers that echoed in the empty hallways. I tried to tell myself it was just exhaustion, that I'd been out there too long. But then I started noticing things that didn't add up. Missing time, strange marks on my skin, like claw marks that appeared overnight. And the dreams. Every night I'd dream of the woods, of those eyes staring back at me from the darkness, waiting, watching. And each time I woke up I could swear I felt that same cold ache in my chest, like something was still there, inside me. It's been a few weeks now and I can feel myself slipping. The other rangers are starting to notice, asking if I'm all right, if I need a break, but I know they can't help me. I know that whatever was out there, whatever marked me, it's still with me, lurking just beneath the surface. Sometimes when I catch my reflection, I see a flash of something else, something pale and hollow-eyed, staring back. And I wonder if I ever really left those woods, or if some part of me is still out there, wandering in the shadows, forever lost. So if you ever find yourself deep in the woods and you hear something strange, a whisper, a growl that scrapes against your bones, don't stay, don't wait. Because there are things out there, things that watch and wait, and sometimes they take more than you're willing to give, and sometimes they don't let you go at all. I'd always loved camping, the quiet solitude, the fresh air, the feeling of being miles away from civilization. It was like nothing else. So when my friend Mike bailed on our annual trip last minute, I decided to go alone. No big deal. I'd been to Fairmount Forest enough times to know it like the back of my hand, or so I thought. I arrived mid-afternoon, parking my car at the small gravel lot and shouldering my pack. The path was familiar, winding through dense thickets of trees, their branches intertwining overhead to form a sort of natural tunnel. I could hear the chirping of birds and the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was peaceful, and I felt at home. The first strange sign appeared about an hour into my hike. I noticed something that shouldn't have been there. An old, dilapidated cabin, half hidden by the trees. I knew every inch of this trail, and there was definitely no cabin here before. It looked ancient, its wooden walls warped and rotting, the windows shattered. A chill ran down my spine, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked closer, feeling the heavy silence that had suddenly descended. It was like the forest was holding its breath, watching. The closer I got, the more details I could make out. Rusted nails poking out of the wood, the faint smell of decay. I peered inside through a broken window, but it was too dark to see anything. The door was slightly ajar, and without really thinking, I pushed it open. Inside, it was dark and damp. There were old, torn blankets on the floor, and what looked like animal bones scattered around. I stepped inside, taking it all in, when I suddenly heard a low creak from somewhere above me, like the sound of someone shifting their weight. I spun around and bolted out of the cabin, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't stop until I was back on the path, looking over my shoulder to make sure I hadn't been followed. The cabin stood there, silent and unyielding, as if daring me to come back. I turned away and kept moving, telling myself I was just spooked, that it was probably just an old hunting cabin I'd somehow missed. The forest started to feel strange after that. The familiar path seemed less clear, the trees too close, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out to me. I walked for what felt like hours, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. a shadow darting between the trees, a flicker of something pale and gaunt. Then I heard the laughter. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper, but it quickly grew louder, echoing through the trees. It was high-pitched and unnatural, like a child's laughter twisted into something malicious. I stopped dead in my tracks, scanning the forest, but there was no one there, just the trees, standing silent and tall, like they were hiding something. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving an even heavier silence in its wake. My heart pounded as I took a step back, every instinct screaming at me to run. But then, from somewhere behind me, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps getting closer. I turned and saw a figure standing on the path about 50 feet away. It looked like a man, but something was off. His limbs were too long, his posture hunched, and his skin was pale as death. He wore what looked like old, tattered clothes, and his face was obscured by shadows. But I could feel his eyes on me, piercing and cold. I took a step back, and he took a step forward, moving in sync with me. I turned and ran, the forest blurring around me as I sprinted down the path. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear him following, his footsteps echoing mine, never missing a beat. I ran until I stumbled into another clearing, a dead end. The path was gone, swallowed by the forest. I spun around, searching for an exit, but the trees had closed in, forming a thick wall of branches and thorns. I was trapped. The laughter started again, but this time it was all around me, coming from every direction. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but it was like it was inside my head, scratching at my mind. I backed up, pressing myself against a tree, and that's when I saw him again. He was standing just a few feet away, his face now fully visible. It was blank, featureless, like a mask of pale flesh stretched over a skull. His mouth twisted into a grin, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. He took a step closer, his arms reaching out, impossibly long fingers curling toward me. "Why did you come here?" he whispered, his voice raspy and hollow. "You don't belong here." I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear as he closed the distance between us. His fingers wrapped around my arm, cold and clammy, and I felt a wave of nausea as he leaned in close, his breath rancid and sour. Just when I thought it was over, I felt something sharp against my skin, and everything went dark. I woke up alone, lying on the forest floor. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the trees. I struggled to my feet, disoriented and weak, but the path was back. The forest was quiet, almost peaceful, like nothing had happened. But when I looked down, I saw fresh claw marks on my arms, deep and bleeding, and I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel him somewhere in the forest, watching me, waiting. I stumbled back to the car, barely able to keep my balance, and I drove out of there as fast as I could. I never went back to Fairmount Forest after that. I moved to a new town, a new state, trying to forget. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that laughter echoing in my ears, and I know he's still out there, waiting for me to return. The forest loomed around me like a fortress of towering black pines, their branches twisted into gnarled, skeletal fingers clawing at the dim sky. I was no stranger to these woods. As a park ranger, I had roamed them countless times. But this time, it felt different. I felt watched, and I could hear things. Small, shuffling footsteps that seemed to shadow me just beyond my sight. I'd been sent out to check on reports of an unauthorized campsite deep in the forest, far beyond the marked trails. It was already late afternoon when I arrived at the trailhead, and by the time I located the site, night had fallen, wrapping the forest in an impenetrable blackness that my flashlight barely pierced. The supposed campsite was nothing but a cold fire pit surrounded by a few scattered belongings, a ragged backpack, a single boot, and a shattered lantern. Then the sound started. At first it was a soft rustling, like the wind brushing through leaves, only there was no wind. The air was deathly still, heavy with the scent of decaying pine needles and wet earth, I tried to shrug it off, telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a fox, but deep down I knew better. I'd been here too many times, heard too many strange stories passed around the ranger station about these woods, tales of things lurking in the shadows, creatures that didn't belong in any textbook. And then I saw it, or rather I almost saw it. A flicker of movement at the edge of my vision, something tall and thin, like a shadow that didn't quite match the trees. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I swung it towards the movement, but there was nothing there, only the endless dark and the oppressive silence. The air grew colder, and I felt a chill run down my spine, an instinctive warning that whatever I was looking for wasn't something I wanted to find. I decided to turn back, but the trail was gone. I spun in a slow circle, trying to find the path I'd come from, but the trees seemed to have shifted, closing in around me like a living wall. I was lost. The realization struck me like a punch to the gut, and I fought to keep my breathing steady. I was no novice. I'd spent years navigating these woods, but now they felt alien, hostile, as if they wanted me gone. The footsteps returned, louder this time, and I could hear a low, guttural growl in the distance. It sounded almost like a dog, but wrong somehow, deeper, more resonant. I strained my ears, hoping to pinpoint its direction, but it seemed to come from all around me, echoing off the trees. Panic gripped me, and I started moving, stumbling over roots and rocks as I tried to put distance between myself and the sound. Then I smelled it, a sickly sweet odor that clung to the air, thick and nauseating. It was like rotting meat, mixed with something even worse, something that I couldn't quite place. I held my breath, fighting the urge to gag, and forced myself to keep moving, even as the ground seemed to shift beneath my feet, the forest playing tricks on my senses. A branch snapped behind me, loud and deliberate, and I broke into a run. My heart hammered in my chest as I weaved through the trees, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my grasp. Every step felt like it was pulling me deeper into a nightmare, the sounds growing louder, closer. I couldn't tell if I was being hunted or if I was running in circles, trapped in a labyrinth of my own making. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I burst into a small clearing, illuminated by the pale light of the moon. There, standing in the center, was a creature that defied logic, a twisted amalgamation of man and beast. It had the body of a man, but its limbs were elongated, too thin and too long, ending in clawed hands that seemed to twitch with a mind of their own. Its face was a nightmare, a grotesque parody of a human face stretched over a canine skull with eyes that glowed a sickly yellow. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and I heard it speak, a garbled mimicry of my own voice. "Why are you here?" it croaked, each word a guttural rasp that sent ice down my spine. I froze, paralyzed by terror, as it took a slow step towards me, its head cocked to one side like it was studying me, savoring my fear. I took a step back, then another, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. And that's when I saw it. My own face, stretched across its back like a macabre trophy, hollow eyes staring back at me in silent horror. I stumbled, nearly falling, and when I looked up again, it was gone, as if it had never been there. The forest was silent again, but now the silence felt alive, heavy with unseen eyes and the weight of things I couldn't understand. I don't remember much about how I found my way back to the trailhead, only that I ran until my legs gave out, and even then I crawled, desperate to escape the oppressive darkness. When I finally emerged from the trees, dawn was breaking, painting the world in a dull gray light. I turned back one last time, half expecting to see the creature watching me from the shadows. But the forest was empty, silent, as if it had swallowed all traces of the night's horrors. I left the ranger station that morning and never went back. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I swear I can still hear it, calling my name from the depths of the forest, waiting for me to return. The forest was thick with fog, the kind that seemed to swallow up everything in its path. I was out for a weekend hike, hoping to clear my mind. But as I trudged deeper into the woods, an unsettling quiet settled around me. It wasn't unusual for the forest to be silent, but this was different. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just an unnatural stillness that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. I'd always been fascinated by the legends surrounding this forest. Locals whispered of creatures that prowled its depths, things that took on the faces of those you knew. Skinwalkers, they called them. Beings that could slip into the guise of anyone they'd laid eyes on. I never put much stock in it. Stories were just stories, right? That belief started to crack when I stumbled upon the campsite. It was eerily similar to mine. A green tent, a small fire pit, even a camp chair set up in front of it. I walked closer, feeling a strange sense of déjà vu, and that's when I saw the backpack. It was just like mine, down to the red stitching on the strap. A chill ran down my spine as I unzipped it, finding inside an exact replica of my gear. My water bottle, my map, my notebook with all my handwritten notes. Everything was there. I backed away, trying to make sense of it. Had I somehow gotten turned around and found my own camp? But no, mine was miles back. I knew that. I'd been walking for hours. I scanned the forest around me, and that's when I noticed the tracks. Hoofprints, but larger than any animal I knew of, pressed deep into the mud. They led away from the camp and into the trees, vanishing into the fog. I should have left right then. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. But something compelled me to follow, a strange curiosity mingled with dread. I moved slowly, my footsteps muffled by the damp earth, and I soon realized I wasn't alone. I heard footsteps, soft, cautious, mirroring my own. I stopped, and so did they. I strained to see through the fog, but it was like a thick curtain, obscuring everything more than a few feet away. Then a shape appeared, a human figure walking towards me. Relief flooded through me. Maybe it was another hiker, someone who could explain what was going on. "Hey!" I called out, my voice sounding hollow in the mist. The figure stopped, standing perfectly still. I took a step closer, squinting to make out details, and as I did, the fog seemed to pull back, revealing a face. My face. I stared, rooted to the spot as I looked at myself. It was like looking into a mirror, but wrong. The eyes were vacant, cold, like they belonged to something that didn't quite understand what it meant to be human. A twisted smile spread across its lips, and then it spoke, in my voice but off, like a poor recording. "You're lost," it whispered, tilting its head. "You shouldn't be here." I stumbled back, my mind reeling. How was this possible? I looked into the eyes of my doppelganger, and a sudden, irrational rage took over. I rushed forward, grabbing at it, but my hands passed through empty air. The figure dissolved into mist, reappearing a few feet away, grinning at me with a hollow, mocking expression. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run, crashing through the trees, branches clawing at my skin. I could hear it behind me, matching my every step, the sound of my own breathing echoing in my ears, louder and louder until I couldn't tell where my breaths ended and its began. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away, to escape whatever twisted reflection had crawled out of the fog. The forest felt endless, an inescapable maze, and the harder I ran, the more it seemed to close in around me. I glanced back, and there it was, gliding through the mist like a ghost, always a few steps behind, always watching with that sickening smile. My legs burned, but I forced myself onward, desperate to reach the edge of the forest, to escape this nightmare. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I burst into a small clearing. My heart stopped as I saw it, another campsite, identical to mine and the one I'd found before. The green tent, the chair, the fire pit. I looked around, disoriented, and then I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, sprawled on the ground, was my own body, motionless and pale, as if I had been lying there all along. I stumbled back, shaking my head in disbelief, but there was no denying it. I was looking at myself, dead, staring up at the sky with empty eyes. The mist began to close in around me, and I heard footsteps approaching. I looked up, and there it was, the thing that wore my face, smiling that horrible smile. It leaned down, close enough that I could feel its breath on my skin, and it whispered, "This is where you belong." And then everything went dark. When I opened my eyes again, I was back at the first campsite, my gear untouched, the morning sun filtering through the trees. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare, but then I saw the hoofprints leading away into the forest. I packed up my things and left as fast as I could, never looking back. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I still see that face staring back at me, wearing my own skin, waiting in the fog for the next poor soul to wander too deep into the woods. And I wonder, just for a second, if maybe I never really left that forest at all. I remember the first time I set foot in Blackwater Pines. I'd been a park ranger for years by then, stationed at various national parks across the country, but Blackwater was different. The forest had a strange, almost oppressive energy, like the trees were watching, waiting for something. The locals had their superstitions, stories of strange creatures, unnatural sounds, people going missing without a trace, but I'd always been skeptical. That changed one cold, foggy night in October. I was assigned to patrol the far side of the park, where a group of campers had reported strange noises near their site. They'd claimed to hear someone, or something, whispering outside their tent. They didn't see anything, but they swore they could feel eyes on them pressing in through the fog. The sun was already setting when I started my hike, casting long claw-like shadows across the forest floor. The trees seemed to close in as I went deeper, their twisted branches reaching out like bony fingers. The temperature dropped with every step, and soon enough I could see my breath clouding in front of me. Blackwater Pines had a way of swallowing sound too. All I could hear was the crunch of my boots and the distant call of a lone owl. After about an hour, I reached the campsite. It was empty, save for a smoldering fire pit and a couple of chairs left abandoned. The campers must have packed up and left in a hurry. I radioed back to the station, letting them know I was going to scout the area to make sure there was no wildlife threat. Bears, maybe, or coyotes. That's what I told myself anyway. But as I circled the campsite, I found tracks. Long, deep prints that didn't look like any animal I knew of. They were like elongated footprints with claws at the tips, sinking into the soft earth as if something heavy had passed through. I bent down to get a closer look, and that's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl echoing from somewhere deeper in the woods. My blood went cold. I turned slowly, scanning the trees with my flashlight. But there was nothing there. Just the fog, swirling thick and soupy, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. I took a step back, nearly stumbling over a tree root when I heard a voice. It was soft, almost like a whisper, but I could make out the words, "Help me." The voice was close, too close, like it was right behind me. I whipped around, flashlight darting between the trees, but there was no one there. I stood there, heart hammering, the beam of my light cutting through the fog in desperate, jerky movements. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I tried to convince myself it was just the wind. But then I saw it. At the edge of my flashlight's reach, just beyond the trees, stood a figure. It looked almost human, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, bending at unnatural angles, and its skin was pale, stretched taut over its bones. It had no face, just a smooth, blank surface where features should have been. But I could feel it watching me, those empty eye sockets boring into my soul. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the thing. It didn't move, just stood there, tilting its head as if it was curious, almost amused. And then it raised one long, spindly arm and pointed at me. My heart stopped as I realized it wasn't alone. All around me, figures began to materialize out of the fog. Their faceless heads turned in my direction, their bodies shifting and contorting as they moved closer. I turned and ran. I didn't care about staying quiet or avoiding roots and rocks. I just ran, tearing through the underbrush, my flashlight swinging wildly. The forest seemed to stretch on forever. the trees twisting into grotesque shapes as I stumbled blindly through the darkness. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps soft but relentless, getting closer with every second. I burst into a clearing and stopped dead. There in the center was a massive stone altar, covered in strange symbols that seemed to glow in the moonlight. I'd never seen anything like it before. It was ancient, worn down by centuries of weather and time. But the thing that really caught my attention was what lay on top of it. A human body, or what was left of one. It was dressed in ranger gear, and it took me a second to recognize the face. My face. I staggered back, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It couldn't be real. It was like looking into a twisted mirror, seeing myself lying there, lifeless and broken. And then I heard that voice again. "Help me." I turned, and the faceless figures were there, circling the altar, their blank heads tilting in unison as they stared at me. I was trapped. I could feel their presence closing in, suffocating me, pulling me toward that stone altar, toward that twisted vision of my own corpse. Just as they reached out, I felt a sharp pain in my chest, like icy fingers wrapping around my heart. I gasped, and everything went black. When I woke up, it was morning. I was lying on the ground by the campsite, alone, with no sign of the altar, the figures, or my other self. The fog had lifted, and the sun was shining through the trees as if nothing had happened. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing, and checked my body for injuries. I was fine, but there was a strange, lingering coldness that I couldn't shake. I made my way back to the station, not saying a word to anyone. Who would believe me? I wasn't even sure I believed it myself. But every night since then, I've heard that voice, whispering from the shadows just beyond my door. "Help me." I've tried to convince myself it was all a nightmare, that my mind was just playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know the truth. Blackwater Pines has secrets, dark and terrible secrets, and it took a piece of me that night, a piece I'll never get back. The forest was as dark as I'd ever seen it. Sure, I'd been out here plenty of times, but there was something about tonight that felt wrong. I'm a park ranger stationed in a remote region of the Appalachian Mountains, where I've seen all sorts of strange things over the years, but nothing had prepared me for the horrors I would face on that particular night. It started with a call from the ranger station just before sunset. A pair of campers had been reported missing near Black Hollow Trail. The sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the dense forest. I knew that finding them after dark would be difficult, but there was no choice. They'd been out there for 2 nights longer than planned, and in these woods, that's usually bad news. I radioed back, grabbed my flashlight, and set out toward Black Hollow. The hike wasn't long, maybe 3 miles, but it felt like an eternity. The deeper I went, the quieter the woods became, as if the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting. About a mile in, I started hearing sounds, low growls and rustling in the underbrush. I knew there were wolves in the area, but this sounded different, deeper, almost like a growl from an animal that didn't belong. I kept moving, but I felt a chill crawl up my spine, that primal warning sign that something was watching me. I arrived at the campsite to find it deserted. Their tent was there, half collapsed and torn, like something, or someone, had ransacked it. Gear was scattered all over the ground. A smashed flashlight, a ripped sleeping bag, some clothes. I called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" But only silence answered back. Just as I was about to radio in, I saw something move in my peripheral vision, a shadow, flitting between the trees. I snapped my flashlight toward it, and for a split second I saw what I can only describe as a man, but not quite. He was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch and contort like they didn't have bones. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his face, if you could call it that, was a grotesque mask of twisted features that didn't quite fit together. I stumbled back, tripping over a tree root, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. The figure stood there for a moment, motionless, before melting back into the shadows as if he'd never been there at all. I knew then that I wasn't dealing with any ordinary forest dweller. I was dealing with something ancient, something that belonged to these woods long before any of us did. I scrambled to my feet and ran back toward the trail, but the forest seemed to close in around me. Every step I took seemed to lead me deeper, not closer to the way out. The trees loomed over me, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with the smell of decay, as if something had died out here a long time ago and was left to rot. I tried the radio again, but all I got was static. The oppressive silence was shattered by a scream, a human scream. It sounded like a woman's voice, high-pitched and full of terror. I bolted in the direction of the scream, adrenaline pushing me through the thick underbrush. I found a clearing, and in the center of it stood another figure. But this one was different. It was hunched over, covered in matted fur, and its head was that of a dog. But its body, it was human. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and it let out a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the ground beneath my feet. The Dogman. I'd heard stories, but I'd never believed them, until now. The creature slowly turned to face me, and that's when I noticed the 2 figures lying at its feet. The campers, or what was left of them. Blood soaked the ground, pooling around their twisted bodies. I could barely recognize them, their faces contorted in an expression of pure horror. I was frozen, too scared to move, my mind racing with thoughts of escape. The Dogman took a step toward me, and I finally snapped out of it, turning and running as fast as I could. My flashlight was bobbing wildly, casting shadows that seemed to reach out and grab at me. The growls grew louder, closer, and I knew that if I stopped, I was done for. After what felt like hours, I burst through the tree line and onto the old service road. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck, fumbling with the keys and finally throwing myself inside. I locked the doors, my hands shaking as I tried to catch my breath. I looked back toward the forest, and for a brief moment, I saw them, the Dogman and that tall, twisted figure, standing side by side watching me. Their eyes glowed in the darkness, a haunting reminder that they were still there, still waiting. I drove back to the ranger station in a daze, barely able to speak as I reported what I'd seen. Of course, they didn't believe me. They chalked it up to exhaustion, told me I was seeing things, that I'd let my imagination get the best of me. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew that those campers were only the latest victims of whatever lurks in those woods. As I left the station that night, I glanced back at the trees, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me. I didn't see them, but I knew they were there, waiting, watching, and I knew that one day they'd come for me too. The forest is a place of secrets, and some things are better left undiscovered. So if you ever find yourself out here, alone in the woods, and you start to feel that prickling on the back of your neck, that sudden chill that makes your hair stand on end, don't ignore it, because you're not alone, and you might not make it back. I'd always thought of camping as a way to get away from it all. No phones, no traffic, just the simplicity of a tent, a fire, and the endless stretch of trees around you. When my brother James and I decided to venture deep into Black Ridge National Forest, we were looking for a weekend of solitude and escape. We had no idea the forest would turn into our worst nightmare. The park ranger at the trailhead was the first sign something was wrong. He was tall and thin, with a grizzled beard and eyes that seemed too bright, almost feverish. He stood at the edge of the forest, watching us with a strange intensity as we loaded our gear into our packs. When we passed by him, he stepped in front of us, blocking our path. "Going deep into the woods?" he asked, his voice a rough whisper, like he hadn't used it in a while. "Yeah, we're headed to the back trails," James replied casually. The ranger shook his head slowly, his gaze fixed on us like he was memorizing our faces. "You'll hear things at night," he said, "but whatever you do, don't go looking for them. Stay in your tent, and if you hear someone calling your name, don't answer." James laughed it off, but I felt a prickle of unease. We thanked the ranger and continued on. but I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes boring into the back of my skull. As we hiked deeper into the forest, the trees grew taller, denser, their branches intertwining to block out most of the sky. The air was thick and heavy, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth, and an eerie quiet settled around us. We made camp by a small clearing, and by the time night fell, the silence had grown oppressive. There were no animals here, no rustle of leaves or chirping of crickets. Just nothing. We cooked dinner in silence, neither of us mentioning the ranger's words, but I could tell James was uneasy too. It was around midnight when I first heard it, a faint, distant whisper drifting through the trees. I sat up, straining my ears, trying to make out the words, but there was only silence. I lay back down, telling myself it was just the wind. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. Someone was whispering my name. David. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. It was James's voice, but it was coming from the trees outside the tent. I glanced over to see James, still fast asleep beside me. I tried to shake him awake, but he wouldn't budge, almost as if he were in a trance. The whisper came again, closer this time, as if it were circling the tent. David, come here. A part of me knew I shouldn't, but the voice was so familiar, so insistent, that I found myself crawling out of the tent, flashlight in hand. The moment I stepped outside, the air turned ice cold, and a fog had crept into the clearing, swirling around the trees like ghostly fingers. I swept the beam of my flashlight across the woods, but there was nothing, just shadows. Then I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. I turned and saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was James, or at least it looked like him. He stood there staring at me, his face expressionless, his eyes hollow. James, I whispered, taking a step forward. The figure smiled, a twisted, unnatural grin that didn't belong on my brother's face. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. I knew it wasn't him. The thing watching me wore his face, but there was something off, something wrong in the way it moved, too fluid, too precise, like a puppet being manipulated by unseen hands. I scrambled back to the tent, desperate to wake James, but when I turned around, he was gone. The figure had vanished, leaving me alone in the darkness. I rushed into the tent, but it was empty. No sleeping bag, no gear. Nothing to indicate that James had ever been there. I called his name, my voice cracking with panic, but there was no answer. I was alone, surrounded by the suffocating silence of the forest. Then, just as I was about to turn and run, I heard it again, my own voice this time calling from somewhere deep in the woods. David? I backed away, my mind racing, and I saw a flicker of movement from the corner of my eye. Something was slinking through the shadows, something tall and spindly, its limbs too long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. It moved slowly, deliberately, like it knew I was watching, like it wanted me to see. And then it stopped, its face emerging from the darkness. It was the ranger. Or at least it had been the ranger. Now his face was a hollow mask, eyes black and empty, his mouth stretched into a wide, gaping smile that revealed rows of sharp, pointed teeth. He stepped forward, his limbs bending and twisting, and I felt an overwhelming urge to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the horror of what I was seeing. You shouldn't have come here, he said, his voice echoing through the trees, as if a dozen voices were speaking at once. This place is ours. I don't remember much of what happened next. I must have blacked out, because when I came to, I was lying on the forest floor, the morning sun filtering through the trees. I was alone. There was no tent, no sign of James, no footprints leading back to the trail. Just the endless stretch of trees and the faint sound of someone whispering my name, carried on the wind. I staggered back to the trailhead, my mind numb, my body aching. The park ranger was gone, and when I asked the rangers at the station about him, they gave me blank looks. "No one like that works here," they said. I never found out what happened to James. The official story is that he wandered off and got lost, that the forest claimed him like it had so many others. But I know the truth. I know that he's still out there, wandering through the woods, his face twisted into that hollow, empty grin, calling my name. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I can still hear him, whispering to me from the darkness, waiting for me to come back. The trip was supposed to be an escape, a chance to get away from everything and everyone. Just me, the trees, and the open sky. I'd been planning this camping trip for months, a solo venture deep into the Black Pine Forest, a place so remote it didn't even have a proper trail on most maps. Exactly what I was looking for. A couple of locals had warned me against going alone, but I brushed them off. I wasn't afraid of isolation. In fact, I craved it. I wanted to be alone. The first day went by in a breeze. I set up my tent in a small clearing, close to a creek. The air was filled with the scent of pine and damp earth, the sounds of birds and rushing water filling the emptiness. It was perfect. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I started a fire and settled in. That's when I heard the first sound. It was subtle at first, just a faint rustling in the trees, barely audible over the crackling fire. I told myself it was probably just a raccoon or maybe a deer. But then it happened again, closer this time. A soft, scraping noise like claws against bark. I glanced into the darkness, straining my eyes, but saw nothing. I shook it off and convinced myself it was just the forest's usual nocturnal activity. But I couldn't shake the unease that had crept into my bones. It was as if the trees themselves were watching, their twisted branches stretching out like gnarled fingers. I forced myself to sleep, though it was restless. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear it again, that strange scraping sound coming from a different direction each time. I half expected to wake up and find claw marks all over my tent. Morning came, and I was relieved to see the sunlight streaming through the trees, chasing away the shadows and whatever else might have been lurking in them. I convinced myself that I was just jumpy, letting my imagination get the better of me. Still, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off. I spent the day hiking deeper into the forest, hoping to shake the sense of unease. I tried to enjoy the scenery, but the strange occurrences from the night before lingered in the back of my mind. Every so often I thought I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a flash of movement between the trees, a dark figure just beyond my line of sight. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. By dusk I was back at my campsite, and I was exhausted. As night fell, the forest grew eerily silent. No birds, no insects, just an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow every sound. I fed the fire, hoping its light would keep whatever was out there at bay. Then I heard it again, the same scraping sound, closer this time. My skin prickled as I scanned the darkness, but the firelight only stretched so far. I stood up, holding my flashlight in one hand and a knife in the other. I wasn't going to let my mind play tricks on me again. I heard a low growl, so deep it was almost a vibration in my chest. My heart pounded as I pointed the flashlight toward the sound, illuminating a pair of yellow eyes staring back at me from the shadows. They were too high up to belong to any ordinary animal. As the creature stepped into the light, my breath caught in my throat. It was a massive wolf-like figure, but not quite right. It stood on two legs, its fur matted and dirty, limbs too long and fingers tipped with sharp, curved claws. Its face was twisted, almost human-like, but its mouth stretched too wide, filled with jagged teeth. The thing tilted its head, as if studying me, and then it spoke. Not with words exactly, but with a voice that seemed to echo inside my mind, a guttural, mocking whisper that sounded almost like my own voice. "You shouldn't have come here." I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a root. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing. Skinwalker. I'd heard stories, but I never believed them. Yet here I was, staring into the eyes of something that shouldn't exist. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to get away from that thing. Branches scratched at my arms and face as I tore through the underbrush. I could hear it behind me, a heavy, deliberate padding sound like it was toying with me. My lungs burned, but I didn't dare stop. The forest seemed to twist around me, the trees closing in, the path unfamiliar and disorienting. I stumbled into a small clearing, and that's when I saw them, more yellow eyes peering out from the darkness. I was surrounded. The creatures stepped forward one by one, each more grotesque than the last. Some looked almost like people, with twisted limbs and faces stretched into unnatural shapes. Others were more animalistic, resembling wolves, bears, things I couldn't even put a name to. And then I noticed something horrifying. Their faces, they weren't just random. They looked like people I knew, twisted and distorted, but unmistakable. There was my friend John, who had gone missing a year ago, and my old boss, who'd disappeared during a hunting trip. Each of them stared at me with those same yellow eyes, their mouths stretching into unnatural smiles. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear as they closed in on me. The leader, my own face staring back at me, leaned in close, its breath hot and rancid. "We've been waiting for you," it whispered. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was alone. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, and the forest looked almost normal. Almost. My tent was gone, my supplies scattered. I staggered to my feet, trying to make sense of what had happened. Was it a nightmare? As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something on the ground. Claw marks, deep and fresh, scored into the earth in a perfect circle around where I'd been lying. And I knew with a sickening certainty that I was no longer alone. The creatures had let me go, but they'd marked me, claimed me. I wasn't the hunter in these woods, I was the hunted, and I knew, sooner or later, they'd be back. I'd always been drawn to the solitude of the wilderness. There's a certain kind of peace that only exists when you're miles away from anyone else. No buzzing phones, no exhaust fumes, just the quiet hum of nature. So when I heard about Bear Trap Valley, a remote stretch of woods known for its untouched beauty and rare wildlife, I packed my gear and set off for a solo trip. I wanted to be somewhere isolated, where I could listen to the trees and watch the stars. I got exactly what I wanted, and much, much more. I reached the valley just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The trees were massive, towering giants with thick canopies that blotted out the sky. It felt like stepping into another world. I set up my tent by a small, clear stream and sat by the water, watching the light fade as the forest around me grew darker. That's when I noticed the silence. It was as if the entire forest held its breath. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, nothing. Just an oppressive, unnatural stillness that settled over the valley like a shroud. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that it was just nerves. It didn't help that I'd heard a story about Bear Trap Valley before I came. A story about the Wendigo Man. Apparently, there'd been sightings of a strange creature lurking in these woods for years. Locals described it as half man, half beast, with eyes that glowed like embers and a face that looked like it had been torn apart and reassembled by something that didn't understand how humans worked. They said it stalked campers, luring them deeper into the woods until they were hopelessly lost. Some called it a skinwalker, others a dogman. But no matter what name they used, the message was always the same. If you saw him, it was already too late. I pushed the story from my mind, hoping that a good night's sleep would settle my nerves. But as the night crept in, I started hearing noises. Soft at first, just faint whispers that seemed to drift through the trees. I told myself it was just the wind, but then they grew louder, forming words almost like a chant. "Come closer." I sat bolt upright, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but the beam barely cut through the shadows. The trees seemed to lean in as if they were listening too, and then I saw it, a pair of glowing eyes watching me from the edge of the trees. They were a sickly yellow, reflecting the light like a predator's, unblinking and fixed right on me. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I was frozen, rooted to the spot. The eyes moved closer, and I could make out its shape. Hulking, twisted, with limbs that were far too long, bending in unnatural ways. It walked upright, but its gait was wrong, lurching forward like it was barely holding itself together. And then I saw its face. The skin was stretched tight over its skull, but parts of it were missing, revealing patches of muscle and bone. Its mouth was twisted into a hideous grin, too wide, like someone had cut it open and forced it to smile. I backed away slowly, not daring to turn my back, but then I heard a voice behind me. "Need some help finding your way back?" I whipped around to see another figure, a man in a park ranger's uniform, his face hidden in the shadows. Relief washed over me for a split second, but then I noticed something strange. His eyes were the same sickly yellow as the creature's, glowing in the darkness. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, his voice hollow, echoing through the trees. "This place isn't safe, not for someone like you." He stepped closer, and that's when I saw it. His face. It was shifting, flickering like an old film reel, as if his skin was fighting to hold its shape. For a moment, I saw his true form, jagged teeth, twisted flesh, and eyes that burned with an unholy light. Then he blinked, and the ranger was back, smiling at me with a strange, knowing look. "Follow me," he said, and his smile widened, stretching far too wide for any human face. I stumbled back, turning to run, but the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees, the shadows, the whispers, they all blurred together, twisting into a nightmare that wrapped itself around me like a noose. I ran blindly, branches clawing at my face and tearing at my clothes. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get away. The chanting grew louder, filling my head with a pulsing, rhythmic beat that made it hard to think. I could feel them closing in, their eyes like burning coals in the darkness, their twisted faces leering at me from every shadow. Eventually, I stumbled into another clearing. I was gasping for breath, my legs trembling beneath me. I looked around, desperate for any sign of civilization, but all I saw were trees, and then I noticed something strange. A figure standing in the center of the clearing, perfectly still. It was me. I blinked, trying to make sense of it, but there was no denying it. It was me, down to the smallest detail. My face, my clothes, even the gash on my cheek from where a branch had caught me. But my other self wasn't moving. It just stood there, staring back at me with those same sickly yellow eyes. In that moment, I realized the truth. This wasn't just a monster hunting me. It was trying to become me, to take my place, my life, my memories. I took a step back, but my other self mirrored me, its face twisting into that same unnatural grin. "You'll make a fine addition," it whispered, its voice blending with mine, filling the clearing with an echo that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I ran, and this time I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the woods, until I could see the faint glow of my car's headlights in the distance. I scrambled into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and drove, never daring to look in the rearview mirror. Even now, as I sit here telling this story, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me out of those woods, that when I looked into those yellow eyes, it took a piece of me, a piece that it's still holding on to, biding its time, waiting. Sometimes when I look in the mirror, I swear I see a flicker of yellow just for a second. So if you ever find yourself in Bear Trap Valley and you see someone who looks like you, run, because the Wendigo Man doesn't just want your life. He wants your soul, and once he takes it, you'll be nothing but another twisted face lost forever in the darkness of the woods. The thing about camping in the deep woods is that once the darkness sets in, you feel as if the forest itself is alive, breathing with every whisper of the wind, watching with every shadow that moves between the trees. When my friends and I decided to take a weekend off to explore a remote part of the forest no one seemed to go to anymore, I thought we'd be in for a thrill. I never imagined it would be the kind of thrill that would haunt my nights long after. We set up camp near a murky stream, the kind that barely gurgles, almost as if it's reluctant to make any noise. The trees here were massive, towering black silhouettes that swayed gently under a starless sky. It was just the four of us, me, my best friend Aaron, his girlfriend Jess, and Chris, a friend from college who was known for his love of ghost stories. The air was thick with the smell of wet moss and decaying leaves, and as we sat around our small fire, Chris began to share one of his usual tales. "Did you know," he started, leaning closer to the fire, his voice low, "there are places in these woods that even the animals avoid? Strange things happen here. People vanish, and sometimes they come back, changed." I rolled my eyes, but a chill ran down my spine. Aaron laughed it off, but Jess clutched her jacket tighter around her shoulders. Chris continued, his face cast in shadows, and I suddenly felt an overwhelming sense of unease, like we were being watched. The first real scare came just after midnight. We were sitting around the dying fire when we heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere in the trees. It was a sound that didn't belong, a sound too deep to be a wolf, too predatory to be anything we'd normally encounter. We all went silent, straining our ears, our breaths coming shallow. "What was that?" Jess whispered, her eyes wide and flickering with panic. Before anyone could answer, a rustling echoed through the underbrush, followed by another growl, closer this time. We grabbed our flashlights and aimed them at the darkness, but the beams only pierced a few feet into the dense foliage. The sound of snapping twigs and crunching leaves got louder, and then we saw it, a pair of eyes, reflecting our light, unnaturally high off the ground. Aaron was the first to break. "We need to get out of here," he muttered, already backing toward the tent. But as soon as he spoke, the creature moved, a towering, dog-like figure with matted fur and elongated limbs, standing on two legs. It had a grotesque face, somewhere between a wolf and a man, its mouth pulled back in a snarl, revealing rows of jagged teeth. We bolted for the tent, but before we could reach it, a flashlight beam caught something else, a figure in a ranger's uniform, standing perfectly still at the edge of the clearing. He was tall, with an unsettling calmness about him, his face hidden under the brim of his hat. "You kids shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and almost too smooth. "There are things in these woods, things that don't take kindly to trespassers." I wanted to ask him what he meant, but the words wouldn't come out. The man stared at us, his eyes devoid of any warmth, like he was assessing whether we were worth saving. Behind him the creature had disappeared, but its presence lingered, a palpable weight in the air. "We're leaving," Chris stammered, grabbing Jess by the arm, but the ranger raised a hand, stopping us. "Leaving won't help," he said, his voice now a disturbing monotone. "They've marked you. You're part of this place now." He stepped forward, his movements too smooth, too unnatural, and I noticed something chilling. His shadow wasn't right. It twisted and stretched, moving independently of his body, as if it had a life of its own. We turned and ran, not daring to look back. The ranger didn't follow, but we could feel his gaze on us, burning through the darkness. We raced through the trees, but the forest seemed to stretch endlessly, the paths twisting and looping back on themselves. Every few moments we'd catch glimpses of shadows that didn't belong, humanoid shapes that slithered between the trees, watching us with eyes that glowed like embers. By the time we stumbled upon another clearing, our breaths ragged and our bodies aching, it was nearly dawn. But then we saw him again, the ranger standing in the center of the clearing, his arms crossed, waiting. He smiled, a cold, mirthless smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "You can't leave," he whispered, his voice echoing unnaturally through the clearing. "The woods have claimed you." At that moment, the shadows around him began to shift, peeling away from the trees and forming into twisted, nightmarish creatures, long limbs, faces that seemed to melt into grotesque expressions, skin that rippled like water. They moved with jerky, unnatural motions, their eyes hollow and lifeless like puppets controlled by unseen strings. We backed away, but the creatures closed in, surrounding us. I could hear Aaron muttering to himself, Jess sobbing softly, and Chris was frozen, staring at the ranger as if he recognized something in him. But before any of us could react, the creatures pounced, their forms merging with ours, shadows enveloping our bodies until everything went black. I woke up in my tent the next morning, alone. I called out for my friends, but there was only silence. The campsite was deserted, the fire pit cold and untouched, as if no one had been there for days. I stumbled through the trees searching for any sign of them, but there was nothing. No footprints, no gear, not even a hint that they'd ever existed. As I reached the edge of the woods, I saw him one last time, the ranger, standing at the tree line, his face expressionless, his eyes dark and empty. I tried to confront him, to ask him what had happened, but he simply turned and disappeared into the forest, leaving me alone with a dreadful certainty. I wasn't supposed to leave those woods, and though I made it out, a part of me never really did. Because sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone, I see shadows in the corners of my room, shifting and writhing like they're waiting for the right moment to pull me back into the darkness. And I know deep down that someday they will. There's a part of Black Hollow Gorge that most people don't go near, even during the day. It's an offshoot from the main trail, marked by a wooden sign so old and faded that the words are barely legible. The locals call it the Hollow, and they say it's cursed. I'd always thought that was just small-town folklore until last spring. I'm a ranger assigned to the gorge, and that particular week I was investigating a series of missing persons cases. 3 hikers had gone missing in the span of a month, all within a few miles of each other. The strange part was that none of their remains or belongings had been found, not even a shred of clothing or a footprint. It was as if they had just vanished into thin air. That day I was patrolling the outer edge of the hollow when I noticed something odd. The woods were quiet, too quiet. I've spent enough time in the forest to know that there's always some sound, birds, insects, the wind through the leaves. But here there was nothing, just a heavy, oppressive silence that made the hair on my arm stand up. I pushed forward, even though every instinct told me to turn back. The air grew colder, and I started to notice strange symbols carved into the trees, circles, spirals, and jagged lines that seemed to writhe under my gaze. I tried to shake off the unease, convincing myself it was just the work of some bored teenagers. Then I found the campsite. It looked abandoned. There was a tent, half collapsed, and a circle of rocks where a fire had been, though it was cold now. But what struck me was the stuff that was left behind. A backpack, a jacket, even a wallet lying open on the ground. No one leaves without their gear, especially out here. I picked up the wallet and saw a driver's license belonging to one of the missing hikers, a guy named Tom Willis. His face stared up at me from the ID photo, frozen in a half smile, and a chill ran down my spine. This was recent. He'd been here, maybe just days before. But where had he gone? As I stood there, I felt the ground tremble slightly like the faintest of earthquakes. I heard a distant rumble, almost like a growl, coming from deeper within the gorge. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow it. The trail twisted downward, deeper into the hollow, and the trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead, blotting out the sun. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, and I started to feel like I was being watched. My flashlight cut through the darkness, but it barely penetrated the shadows. Every few steps I thought I saw movement just beyond the edge of the light, but when I turned, there was nothing. Then I heard it, a whisper, faint and chilling, calling my name. Paul. I whipped around, shining the light in every direction, but there was no one there. The voice came again, closer this time. It wasn't a familiar voice. It sounded distorted, like it was coming from underwater. Paul, come closer. I stepped back, my heart racing, but as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. Just ahead, standing in the shadows, was a figure, tall and thin, with limbs that looked too long and bent at strange angles. Its face was featureless, just smooth, pale skin where its eyes and mouth should have been. I froze, unable to look away as it began to move towards me, gliding soundlessly over the ground. I stumbled back, trying to run, but another figure stepped out of the darkness to my left, and then another to my right. They surrounded me, each one identical, tall, hollow-eyed, with that eerie, blank face. They moved closer, closing in until I was trapped. "Stay with us, Paul," they whispered in unison, their voices blending together into a low, droning hum that seemed to vibrate in my bones. "We've been waiting." My mind raced as I searched for a way out. I remembered the old tales I'd heard about the Hollow Ones, figures that were said to be the spirits of those who'd vanished here, cursed to roam the woods forever, searching for the living to join them. I always thought it was just a myth, but as I looked into those empty faces, I knew it was real. Desperate, I closed my eyes and charged forward, hoping to break through the line of figures. I felt their cold, bony fingers brush against my skin as I ran, but somehow I made it past them, crashing through the trees and stumbling back up the path. I didn't stop until I was out of the gorge, gasping for breath as I reached the main trail. I radioed for backup, but when we returned, there was nothing there. The campsite was gone, as if it had never existed. No footprints, no signs of struggle, just an empty forest, silent and still. I haven't been back to the hollow since. The rangers say I was just hallucinating, that I'd been in the woods too long, but I know what I saw. Every now and then I still hear that voice in my dreams, calling my name, beckoning me back to the gorge. I wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, with the memory of those hollow faces burned into my mind. I've warned the others to stay away from that part of the forest, but people still go missing now and then, and I know deep down that the Hollow Ones are still out there, waiting in the shadows for the next poor soul to wander too far. So if you ever find yourself in Black Hollow Gorge, remember this. Some places aren't meant to be explored, because once you step into the hollow, you may never come back out.